Chapter 25 of The Mystery of a Hansom Cab by Fergus Hume. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 25. What Dr. Chinston Said. His resolution taken, Brian did not let the grass grow under his feet, but rode over in the afternoon to tell Madge of his intended departure. The servant told him she was in the garden, so he went there, and guided by the sound of merry voices and the laughter of pretty women, soon found his way to the lawn tennis ground. Madge and her guests were there, seated under the shade of a great wych-elm, and watching with great interest a single-handed match being played between Royston and Peterson, both of whom were capital players. Mr. Frettlby was not present. He was inside writing letters and talking with old Mr. Valpy, and Brian gave a sigh of relief as he noted his absence. Madge caught sight of him as he came down the garden path, and flew quickly towards him with outstretched hands as he took his hat off.
"How good of you to come,"
she said in a delighted tone as she took his arm.
"and on such a hot day."
"Yes, it's something fearful in the shade,"
said pretty Mrs. Royston with a laugh, putting up her sunshade.
"Pardon me if I think the contrary,"
replied Fitzgerald, bowing, with an expressive look at the charming group of ladies under the great tree. Mrs. Royston blushed and shook her head.
"Ah, it's easy seeing you come from Ireland, Mr. Fitzgerald,"
she observed as she resumed her seat.
"You are making Madge jealous."
"So he is,"
answered Madge with a gay laugh.
"I shall certainly inform Mr. Royston about you, Brian, if you make these gallant remarks."
"Here he comes, then,"
said her lover, as Royston and Peterson, having finished their game, walked off the tennis ground and joined the group under the tree. Though in tennis flannels, they both looked remarkably warm, and throwing aside his racket, Mr. Royston sat down with a sigh of relief.
"Thank goodness it's over, and that I have won,"
he said, wiping his heated brow.
"Galley slaves couldn't have worked harder than we have done, while all you idle folks sat sub tigmine fagi."
"Which means?"
asked his wife lazily.
"Had onlookers see most of the game,"
answered her husband impudently.
"I suppose that's what you call a free and easy translation,"
said Peterson, laughing.
"Mrs. Royston ought to give you something for your new and original adaptation of Virgil."
"Let it be iced, then,"
retorted Royston, lying full length on the ground and staring up at the blue of the sky as seen through the network of leaves.
"I always like my something iced."
"It's a way you've got,"
said Madge with a laugh as she gave him a glass filled with some sparkling golden-coloured liquor, with a lump of ice clinking musically against the side of it.
"He's not the only one who's got that way,"
said Peterson gaily when he had been similarly supplied.
"It's a way we've got in the army, it's a way we've got in the navy, it's a way we've got in the varsity, and so say all of us,"
finished Royston, and holding out his glass to be replenished.
"I'll have another, please. Whew, it is hot."
"What, the drink?"
asked Julia, with a giggle.
"No, the day,"
answered Felix, making a face at her.
"It's the kind of day one feels inclined to adopt Sidney Smith's advice, by getting out of one's skin and letting the wind whistle through one's bones."
"With such a hot wind blowing,"
said Peterson gravely,
"I'm afraid they'd soon be broiled bones."
"Go, giddy one,"
retorted Felix, throwing his hat at him.
"or I'll drag you into the blazing sun and make you play another game."
"Not I,"
replied Peterson coolly.
"Not being a salamander, I'm hardly used to your climate yet, and there is a limit even to lawn tennis."
And turning his back on Royston, he began to talk to Julia Featherweight. Meanwhile, Madge and her lover, leaving all this frivolous chatter behind them, were walking slowly towards the house, and Brian was telling her of his approaching departure, though not of his reasons for it.
"I received a letter last night,"
he said, turning his face away from her.
"and as it's about some important business, I must start at once."
"I don't think it will be long before we follow,"
answered Madge thoughtfully.
Papa leaves here at the end of the week.
Why?
I'm sure I don't know.
said Madge petulantly.
He is so restless and never seems to settle down to anything. He says for the rest of his life he's going to do nothing but wander all over the world.
There suddenly flashed across Fitzgerald's mind a line from Genesis which seemed singularly applicable to Mr. Frettlby.
A fugitive and a vagabond thou shalt be in the earth. Everyone gets these restless fits sooner or later,
he said idly.
In fact,
with an uneasy laugh,
I believe I'm in one myself.
That puts me in mind of what I heard Dr. Chinston say yesterday,
she said.
This is the age of unrest, as electricity and steam have turned us all into bohemians.
Ah, Bohemia is a pleasant place,
said Brian absently, unconsciously quoting Thackeray.
but we all lose our way to it late in life.
At that rate we won't lose our way to it for some time,
she said, laughing as they stepped into the drawing-room, so cool and shady after the heat and glare outside. As they entered, Mr. Frettlby rose from a chair near the window. He appeared to have been reading, for he held a book in his hand.
"What, Fitzgerald?"
he exclaimed in a hearty tone as he held out his hand.
"I am glad to see you."
I let you know I am living, don't I?
replied Brian, his face flushing as he reluctantly took the proffered hand.
But the fact is I've come to say goodbye for a few days.
"Ah, going back to town, I suppose,"
said Mr. Frettlby, lying back in his chair and playing with his watch-chain.
"I don't know that you are wise, exchanging the clear air of the country for the dusty atmosphere of Melbourne."
Yet Madge tells me you are going back,
said Brian, idly toying with the vase of flowers on the table.
"Depends upon circumstances,"
replied the other carelessly.
"I may and I may not. You go on business, I presume."
Well, the fact is, Calton...
Here Brian stopped suddenly and bit his lip with vexation, for he had not intended to mention the lawyer's name.
"Yes?"
said Mr. Frettlby interrogatively, sitting up quickly and looking keenly at Brian.
Wants to see me on business,
he finished awkwardly.
"Connected with the sale of your station, I suppose,"
said Frettlby, still keeping his eyes on the young man's face.
"Can't have a better man. Calton's an excellent man of business."
a little too excellent.
replied Fitzgerald ruefully.
He's a man who can't leave well alone.
"Apropos of what?"
Of nothing.
answered Fitzgerald hastily, and just then his eyes met those of Frettlby. The two men looked at one another steadily for a moment, but in that short space of time a single name flashed through their brains, the name of Rosanna Moore. Mr. Frettlby was the first to lower his eyes and break the spell.
"Ah, well,"
he said lightly as he rose from his chair and held out his hand.
"if you are 2 weeks in town, call at St. Kilda, and it's more than likely you will find us there."
Brian shook hands in silence and watched him pick up his hat and move on to the veranda and then out into the hot sunshine.
He knows,
he muttered involuntarily.
Knows what, sir?
said Madge, who came silently behind him and slipped her arm through his.
That you are hungry and want something to eat before you leave us?
I don't feel hungry,
said Brian as they walked towards the door.
Nonsense,
answered Madge merrily, who, like Eve, was on hospitable thoughts intent.
I'm not going to have you appear in Melbourne, a pale, fond lover, as though I were treating you badly. Come, sir, no.
she continued, putting up her hand as he tried to kiss her.
Business first, pleasure afterwards.
And they went into the dining-room, laughing. Mark Frettlby wandered down to the lawn tennis ground, thinking of the look he had seen in Brian's eyes. He shivered for a moment in the hot sunshine, as though it had grown suddenly chill.
"Someone stepping across my grave,"
he murmured to himself with a cynical smile.
"Bah, how superstitious I am, and yet he knows, he knows.
Come on, sir.
cried Felix, who had just caught sight of him.
A racket awaits you.
Frettlby awoke with a start, and found himself near the lawn tennis ground, and Felix at his elbow smoking a cigarette. He roused himself with a great effort, and tapped the young man lightly on the shoulder.
What?
He said with a forced laugh.
Do you really expect me to play lawn tennis on such a day? You are mad.
I'm hot, you mean?
Retorted the imperturbable Rolleston, blowing a wreath of smoke.
That's a foregone conclusion,
said Dr. Chinston, who came up at that moment.
Such a charming novel,
cried Julia, who had just caught the last remark.
What is?
Asked Peterson, rather puzzled.
Howell's book, a foregone conclusion,
said Julia, also looking puzzled.
Weren't you talking about it?
I'm afraid this talk is getting slightly incoherent,
said Felix with a sigh.
We all seem madder than usual today.
Speak for yourself,
said Chinston indignantly.
I'm as sane as any man in the world.
Exactly,
retorted the other coolly.
That's what I say. And you, being a doctor, ought to know that every man and woman in the world is more or less mad.
Where are your facts?
asked Chinston, smiling.
My facts are all visible ones,
said Felix, gravely pointing to the company.
They're all crooked on some point or another.
There was a chorus of indignant denial at this, and then everyone burst out laughing at the extraordinary way in which Mr. Rolleston was arguing.
If you go on like that in the house,
said Frettlby, amused,
you will, at all events, have an entertaining parliament.
Ah, they'll never have an entertaining parliament till they admit ladies,
observed Peterson with a quizzical glance at Julia.
It will be a parliament of love, then,
retorted the doctor dryly.
And not medieval either.
Frettlby took the doctor's arm and walked away with him.
I want you to come up to my study, Doctor,
he said as they strolled towards the house,
and examine me.
Why, don't you feel well?
said Chinston as they entered the house.
Not lately,
replied Frettlby.
I'm afraid I've got heart disease.
The doctor looked sharply at him and then shook his head.
Nonsense,
he said cheerfully.
It's a common delusion with people that they have heart disease, and in 9 cases out of 10 it's all imagination. Unless, indeed,
he added waggishly,
the patient happens to be a young man.
Ah, I suppose you think I'm safe as far as that goes,
said Frettlby as they entered the study.
And what did you think of Rolleston's argument about people being mad?
It was amusing,
replied Chinston, taking a seat, Frettlby doing the same.
That's all I can say about it, though, mind you, I think there are more mad people at large than the world is aware of.
Indeed.
Yes. Do you remember that horrible story of Dickens in the Pickwick Papers about the man who was mad and knew it, yet successfully concealed it for years? Well, I believe there are many people like that in the world, people whose lives are one long struggle against insanity, and yet who eat, drink, talk, and walk with the rest of their fellow men, apparently as gay and light-hearted as they are.
How extraordinary.
Half the murders and suicides are done in temporary fits of insanity,
went on Chinston.
And if a person broods over anything, his incipient madness is sure to break out sooner or later. But, of course, there are cases where a perfectly sane person may commit a murder on the impulse of the moment, but I regard such persons as mad for the time being. But, again, a murder may be planned and executed in the most cold-blooded manner.
And in the latter case?
Said Frettlby without looking at the doctor and playing with a paper knife.
Do you regard the murderer As mad?
Yes, I do.
answered the doctor bluntly.
He is as mad as a person who kills another because he supposes he has been told by God to do so. Only there is method in his madness. For instance, I believe that Hansom Cab murder in which you were mixed up.
I wasn't mixed up in it,
interrupted Frettlby, pale with anger.
Beg pardon,
said Chinston coolly.
A slip of the tongue. I was thinking of Fitzgerald. Well, I believe that crime to have been premeditated and that the man who committed it was mad. He is no doubt at large now, walking about and conducting himself as sanely as you or I, yet the germ of insanity is there, and sooner or later he will commit another crime.
How do you know it was premeditated?
asked Frettlby abruptly.
Anyone can see that,
answered the other.
White was watched on that night, and when Fitzgerald went away, the other was ready to take his place, dressed the same.
That's nothing,
retorted Frettlby, looking at his companion sharply.
There are dozens of men in Melbourne who wear evening dress, light coats, and soft hats. In fact, I generally wear them myself.
Well, that might have been a coincidence,
said the doctor, rather disconcerted.
But the use of chloroform puts the question beyond a doubt. People don't usually carry chloroform about with them.
I suppose not,
answered the other, and then the matter dropped. Chinston made an examination of Mark Frettlby, and when he had finished, his face was very grave, though he laughed at the millionaire's fears.
You are all right,
he said gaily.
Action of the heart a little weak, that's all. Only,
impressively,
avoid excitement. Avoid excitement.
Just as Frettlby was putting on his coat, a knock came to the door, and Madge entered.
Brian is gone,
she began.
Oh, I beg your pardon, Doctor, but is Papa ill?
she asked with sudden fear.
No, child, no,
said Frettlby hastily.
I'm all right. I thought my heart was affected, but it isn't.
Not a bit of it,
answered Chinston reassuringly.
All right. Only avoid excitement.
But when Frettlby turned to go to the door, Madge, who had her eyes fixed on the doctor's face, saw how grave it was.
There is danger,
she said, touching his arm as they paused for a moment at the door.
No,
he answered hastily.
Yes, there is,
she persisted.
Tell me the worst, it is best for me to know.
The doctor looked at her in some doubt for a few moments, and then placed his hand on her shoulder.
My dear young lady,
he said gravely,
I will tell you what I have not dared to tell your father.
What?
she asked in a low voice, her face growing pale.
His heart is affected.
And there is great danger.
Yes, great danger. In the event of any sudden shock.
He hesitated.
Yes.
He would probably drop down dead.
My God.
End of chapter 25. Chapter 26 of The Mystery of a Hansom Cab by Fergus Hume. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 26. Kilsip has a theory of his own. Mr. Calton sat in his office reading a letter he had just received from Fitzgerald, and, judging from the complacent smile upon his face, it seemed to give him the greatest satisfaction.
I know,
wrote Brian,
that now that you have taken up the affair, you will not stop until you find out everything. So, as I want the matter to rest as at present, I will anticipate you and reveal all. You were right in your conjecture I knew something likely to lead to the detection of White's murderer. But when I tell you my reasons for keeping such a thing secret, I'm sure you will not blame me. Mind you, I do not say that I know who committed the murder, but I have suspicions, very strong suspicions, and I wish to God Rosanna Moore had died before she told me what she did. However, I will tell you all and leave you to judge as to whether I was justified in concealing what I was told. I will call at your office sometime next week, and then you will learn everything that Rosanna Moore told me. But once you are possessed of the knowledge, you will pity me.
Most extraordinary,
mused Calton, leaning back in his chair as he laid down the letter.
I wonder if he's about to tell me that he killed White after all, and that Sal Rawlins perjured herself to save him. No, that's nonsense, or she'd have turned up in better time, and wouldn't have risked his neck up to the last moment. Though I make it a rule never to be surprised at anything, I expect what Brian Fitzgerald has to tell me will startle me considerably. I've never met with such an extraordinary case, and from all appearances the end isn't reached yet. After all,
said Mr. Calton thoughtfully,
truth is stranger than fiction.
Here a knock came to the door, and in answer to an invitation to enter, it opened, and Kilsip glided into the room.
"You're not engaged, sir?"
he said in his soft, low voice.
Oh dear, no,
answered Calton carelessly.
Come in, come in.
Kilsip closed the door softly, and gliding along in his usual velvet-footed manner, sat down in a chair near Calton's, and placing his hat on the ground, looked keenly at the barrister.
Well, Kilsip,
said Calton with a yawn, playing with his watch-chain.
Any good news to tell me?
Well, nothing particularly new,
purred the detective, rubbing his hands together.
Nothing new and nothing true and no matter,
said Calton, quoting Emerson.
And what have you come to see me about?
The Hansom Cab murder,
replied the other quietly.
The deuce!
cried Calton, startled out of his professional dignity.
And have you found out who did it?
No,
answered Kilsip rather dismally.
But I have an idea.
So had Corby,
retorted Calton dryly.
An idea that ended in smoke. Have you any practical proofs?
Not yet.
That means you are going to get some?
If possible.
Much virtue in if,
quoted Calton, picking up a pencil and scribbling idly on his blotting paper.
And to whom does your suspicion point?
Aha,
said Mr. Kilsip cautiously.
Don't know him,
answered the other coolly.
Family name Humbug, I presume. Bosh! Whom do you suspect?
Kilsip looked round cautiously as if to make sure they were alone, and then said in a stage whisper,
Roger Morland.
That was the young man that gave evidence as to how White got drunk?
Kilsip nodded.
Well, and how do you connect him with the murder?
Do you remember, in the evidence given by the cabmen, Royston and Rankin, they both swore that the man who was with White on that night wore a diamond ring on the forefinger of the right hand?
What of that? Nearly every second man in Melbourne wears a diamond ring.
But not on the forefinger of the right hand.
Oh, and Morland wears a ring in that way?
Yes.
Merely a coincidence. Is that all your proof?
All I can obtain at present.
It's very weak,
said Calton scornfully.
The weakest proofs may form a chain to hang a man,
observed Kilsip sententiously.
Morland gave his evidence clearly enough,
said Calton, rising and pacing the room.
He met White, they got drunk together, White went out of the hotel, and shortly afterwards Morland followed with the coat, which was left behind by White, and then someone snatched it from him.
Ah, did they?
Interrupted Kilsip quickly.
So Morland says,
said Calton, stopping short.
I understand you think Morland was not so drunk as he would make out, and that, after following White outside, he put on his coat and got into the cab with him.
That is my theory.
It's ingenious enough,
said the barrister.
But why should Morland murder White? What motive had he?
Those papers.
Phew, another idea of Gorby's,
said Calton angrily.
How do you know there were any papers?
The fact is, Calton did not intend Kilsip to know that White really had papers until he heard what Fitzgerald had to tell him.
And another thing,
said Calton, resuming his walk.
If your theory is correct, which I don't think it is, what became of White's coat? Has Morland got it?
No, he has not,
answered the detective decisively.
You seem very positive about it,
said the lawyer after a moment's pause.
Did you ask Morland about it?
A reproachful look came into Kilsip's white face.
Not quite so green,
he said, forcing a smile.
I thought you'd a better opinion of me than that, Mr. Calton. Ask him? No.
Then how did you find out?
The fact is, Morland is employed as a barman in a Kangaroo Hotel.
A barman?
Echoed Calton.
And he came out here as a gentleman of independent fortune. Why, hang it, man, that in itself is sufficient to prove that he had no motive to murder White. Morland pretty well lived on White, so what could have induced him to kill his golden goose and become a barman? Phew, the idea is absurd.
Well, you may be right about the matter,
said Kilsip rather angrily.
And if Gorby makes mistakes, I don't pretend to be infallible. But at all events, when I saw Morland at the bar, he wore a silver ring on the forefinger of his right hand.
Silver isn't a diamond.
No, but it shows that was the finger he was accustomed to wear his ring on. When I saw that, I determined to search his room. I managed to do so while he was out, and found...
A mare's nest?
Kilsip nodded.
And so your castle of cards falls to the ground,
said Calton jestingly.
Your idea is absurd. Morland no more committed the murder than I did. Why, he was too drunk on that night to do anything.
So he says.
Well, men don't calumniate themselves for nothing.
It was a lesser danger to avert a greater one,
replied Kilsip coolly.
I am sure that Morland was not drunk on that night. He only said so to escape awkward questions as to his movements. Depend upon it, he knows more than he lets out.
Well, and how do you intend to set about the matter?
I shall start looking for the coat first.
Ah, you think he has hidden it?
I'm sure of it. My theory is this. When Morland got out of the cab at Powlett Street...
But he didn't,
interrupted Calton angrily.
Let us suppose, for the sake of argument, that he did,
said Kilsip quietly.
I say when he left the cab, he walked up Powlett Street, turned to the left down George Street, and walked back to town through the Fitzroy Gardens. Then, knowing that the coat was noticeable, he threw it away, or rather, hid it, and walked out of the gardens through the town.
In evening dress, more noticeable than the coat.
He wasn't in evening dress,
said Kilsip quietly.
No, neither was he,
observed Calton, eagerly recalling the evidence at the trial.
Another blow to your theory. The murderer was in evening dress. The cabman said so.
Yes, because he had seen Mr. Fitzgerald in evening dress a few minutes before, and thought he was the same man who got into the cab with White.
Well, what of that?
If you remember, the second man had his coat buttoned up. Morland wore dark trousers, at least I suppose so, and with the coat buttoned up, it was easy for the cabman to make the mistake, believing, as he did, that it was Mr. Fitzgerald.
That sounds better,
said Calton thoughtfully.
And what are you going to do?
Look for the coat in the Fitzroy Gardens.
Sure, a wild goose chase.
Possibly,
said Kilsip as he arose to go.
And when shall I see you again?
Said Calton.
Oh, tonight,
said Kilsip, pausing at the door.
I'd nearly forgotten. Mother Guttersnipe wants to see you.
Why? What's up?
She's dying and wants to tell you some secret.
Rosanna Moore, by Jove,
said Calton.
She'll tell me something about her. I'll get to the bottom of this yet. All right, I'll be here at 8 o'clock.
Very well, sir.
And the detective glided out.
I wonder if that old woman knows anything,
said Calton to himself as he resumed his seat.
She may have overheard some conversation between White and his mistress, and intends to divulge it. Well, I'm afraid when Fitzgerald does confess, I shall know all about it beforehand.
End of chapter 26. Chapter 27 of The Mystery of a Hansom Cab by Fergus Hume. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 27. Mother Guttersnipe joins the majority. Punctual to his appointment, Kilsip called at Coulson's office at 8 o'clock in order to guide him through the squalid labyrinths of the slums. He found the barrister waiting impatiently for him. The fact is, Calton had got it into his head that Rosanna Moore was at the bottom of the whole mystery, and every new piece of evidence he discovered went to confirm this belief. When Rosanna Moore was dying, she might have confessed something to Mother Guttersnipe, which would hint at the name of the murderer, and he had a strong suspicion that the old hag had received hush money in order to keep quiet. Several times before, Calton had been on the point of going to her and trying to get the secret out of her, that is, if she knew it, but now fate appeared to be playing into his hands, and a voluntary confession was much more likely to be true than one dragged piecemeal from unwilling lips. By the time Kilsip made his appearance, Calton was in a high state of excitement.
I suppose we'd better go at once,
he said to Kilsip as he lit a cigar.
That old hag may go off at any moment.
She might,
assented Kilsip doubtfully.
But I wouldn't be a bit surprised if she pulled through. Some of these old women have 9 lives, like a cat.
Not improbable,
retorted Calton as they passed into the brilliantly lighted street.
Her nature seemed to me to be essentially feline. But tell me,
he went on,
what's the matter with her? Old age?
Partly. Drink also, I think,
answered Kilsip.
Besides, her surroundings are not very healthy, and her dissipated habits have pretty well settled her.
It isn't anything catching, I hope,
cried the barrister with a shudder as they passed into the crowd of Burke Street.
Don't know, sir, not being a doctor,
answered the detective stolidly.
Oh,
ejaculated Calton in dismay.
It will be all right, sir,
said Kilsip reassuringly.
I've been there dozens of times, and I'm all right.
I dare say,
retorted the barrister.
But I may go there once and catch it, whatever it is.
Take my word, sir, it's nothing worse than old age and drink.
Has she a doctor?
Won't let one come near her. Prescribes for herself.
Gin, I suppose. Much more unpleasant than the usual run of medicines.
In a short time they found themselves in Little Burke Street, and after traversing a few dark and narrow lanes, by this time they were more or less familiar to Calton, they found themselves before Mother Guttersnipe's den. They climbed the rickety stairs which groaned and creaked beneath their weight, and found Mother Guttersnipe lying on the bed in the corner. The elfish black-haired child was playing cards with a slatternly-looking girl at a deal table by the faint light of a tallow candle. They both sprang to their feet as the strangers entered, and the elfish child pushed a broken chair in a sullen manner towards Mr. Calton, while the other girl shuffled into a far corner of the room and crouched down there like a dog. The noise of their entry awoke the hag from an uneasy slumber into which she had fallen. Sitting up in bed, she huddled the clothes round her. She presented such a gruesome spectacle that involuntarily Calton recoiled. Her white hair was unbound and hung in tangled masses over her shoulders in snowy profusion. Her face, parched and wrinkled, with the hooked nose and beady black eyes like those of a mouse, was poked forward, and her skinny arms, bare to the shoulder, were waving wildly about as she grasped at the bedclothes with her claw-like hands. The square bottle and the broken cup lay beside her. and filling herself a dram, she lapped it up greedily. The irritant brought on a paroxysm of coughing, which lasted until the elfish child shook her well and took the cup from her.
Greedy old beast,
muttered the amiable infant, peering into the cup.
You drink the yarrow dry, I believe.
Yeah,
muttered the old woman feebly.
Who's they, Lizer?
she said, shading her eyes with one trembling hand while she looked at Calton and the detective.
The police cove in the swell,
said Liza suddenly.
Come to see you turn up your toes.
I ain't dead yet, ye whelp,
snarled the hag with sudden energy.
And if I gets up, I'll turn your toes, cuss ye.
Liza gave a shrill laugh of disdain, and Kilsip stepped forward.
None of this,
he said sharply, taking Liza by one thin shoulder and pushing her over to where the other girl was crouching.
Stop there, till I tell you to move.
Liza tossed back her tangled black hair and was about to make some impudent reply when the other girl, who was older and wiser, put out her hand and pulled her down beside her. Meanwhile, Calton was addressing himself to the old woman in the corner.
You wanted to see me?
he said gently, for, notwithstanding his repugnance to her, she was, after all, a woman and dying.
Yes, cuss ye,
croaked Mother Guttersnipe, lying down and pulling the greasy bedclothes up to her neck.
You ain't a parson?
with sudden suspicion.
No, I'm a lawyer.
I ain't a-going to have the cussed parsons a-prowling around here,
growled the old woman viciously.
I ain't a-going to die yet, cuss ye. I'm a-going to get well and strong and have a good time of it.
I'm afraid you won't recover,
said Calton gently.
You'd better let me send for a doctor.
No, I shan't,
retorted the hag, aiming a blow at him with all her feeble strength.
I ain't a-going to have my inside spiled with salts and senner. I don't want neither parsons nor doctors, I don't. I wouldn't have a lawyer, only I'm a-thinking of making my will, I am.
Mind I gets the watch,
yelled Liza from the corner.
If you gives it to Sal, I'll tear her eyes out.
Silence,
said Kilsip sharply, and with a muttered curse Liza sat back in her corner.
Sharper than a serpent's tooth she are,
whined the old woman when quiet was once more restored.
That young devil have fed in my home, and now she turns, cuss her.
Well, well,
said Calton rather impatiently.
What is it you wanted to see me about?
Don't be in such a hurry,
said the hag with a scowl.
Or I'm blamed if I'll tell you anything, s'help me.
She was evidently growing very weak, so Calton turned to Kilsip and told him in a whisper to get a doctor. The detective scribbled a note on some paper, and giving it to Liza, ordered her to take it. At this the other girl arose, and putting her arm in that of the child's, they left together.
Them two young ussies gone?
said Mother Guttersnipe.
Right you are, for I don't want what I've got to tell to get into the newspaper, I don't.
And what is it?
asked Calton, bending forward. The old woman took another drink of gin, and it seemed to put life into her, for she sat up in the bed and commenced to talk rapidly, as though she were afraid of dying before her secret was told.
You've been here afore?
she said, pointing one skinny finger at Calton.
And you wanted to find out all about her, but you didn't. She wouldn't let me tell, for she was always a proud jade, a-flouncing round while her poor mother was a-starvin'.
Her mother? Are you Rosanna Moore's mother?
cried Calton, considerably astonished.
May I die if I ain't,
croaked the hag.
Her poor father died of drink, cuss him, and I'm a-follerin' him to the same place in the same way. You weren't about town in the old days, or you'd have been after her, cuss ye.
After Rosanna?
The wary girl,
answered Mother Guttersnipe.
She were on the stage, she were, and my eye, what a swell she were, with all the coves a-dyin' for her, and she dancing over their black arts, cuss 'em, but she was allays good to me till came.
Who came?
yelled the old woman, raising herself on her arm, her eyes sparkling with vindictive fury.
A-comin' round with diamonds and gold, and a-ruinin' my poor girl. And how he's held his bloomin' head up all these years, as if he were a saint, cuss him! Cuss him!
Whom does she mean?
Whispered Calton to Kilsip.
Mean?
Screamed Mother Guttersnipe, whose sharp ears had caught the muttered question.
Why, Mark Frettlby!
Good God!
Calton rose up in his astonishment, and even Kilsip's inscrutable countenance displayed some surprise.
Aye, he were a swell in them days,
pursued Mother Guttersnipe.
And he comes a philanderin' around my gal, cuss him, and ruins her, and leaves her and the child to starve, like a blackguarded villain as he were.
The child? Her name?
Bah!
Retorted the hag with scorn.
As if you didn't know my granddaughter Sal.
Sal? Mark Frettlby's child?
Yes, and as pretty a girl as the other, though she happened to be born on the wrong side of the edge. Oh, I've seen her a-sweepin' along in her silks and satins, as though we were dirt. And Sal, her half-sister, cuss her.
Exhausted by the effort she had made, the old woman sank back in her bed, while Calton sat dazed, thinking over the astounding revelation that had just been made. That Rosanna Moore should turn out to be Mark Frettlby's mistress he hardly wondered at. After all, the millionaire was but a man, and in his young days had been no better and no worse than the rest of his friends. Rosanna Moore was pretty, and was evidently one of those women who, rakes at heart, prefer the untrammelled freedom of being a mistress to the sedate bondage of a wife. In questions of morality, so many people live in glass houses that there are few nowadays who can afford to throw stones. Calton did not think any the worse of Frettlby for his youthful follies. But what did surprise him was that Frettlby should be so heartless as to leave his child to the tender mercies of an old hag like Mother Guttersnipe. It was so entirely different from what he knew of the man that he was inclined to think that the old woman was playing him a trick.
Did Mr. Frettlby know Sal was his child?
He asked.
Naughty,
snarled Mother Guttersnipe in an exultant tone.
He thought she was dead, he did, arter Rosanna gave him the go-by.
And why did you not tell him?
'Cause I wanted to break his heart if he had any,
said the old beldame vindictively.
Sal was a-going wrong as fast as she could till she was tuck from me. If she had gone and got into quod, I'd have gone to him and said, Look at your daughter, how I've ruined her as you did mine.
You wicked woman,
said Calton, revolted at the malignity of the scheme.
You sacrificed an innocent girl for this.
None of your preachin',
retorted the hag suddenly.
I ain't been brought up for a saint, I ain't, and I wanted to pay him out. He paid me well to hold my tongue about my daughter, and I've got it here.
Laying her hand on the pillow.
All gold, good gold, and mine, cuss me.
Calton rose. He felt quite sick at this exhibition of human depravity, and longed to be away. As he was putting on his hat, however, the two girls entered with the doctor, who nodded to Kilsip, cast a sharp scrutinizing glance at Calton, and then walked over to the bed. The two girls went back to their corner and waited in silence for the end. Mother Guttersnipe had fallen back in the bed, with one claw-like hand clutching the pillow as if to protect her beloved gold, and over her face a deadly paleness was spreading, which told the practised eye of the doctor that the end was near. He knelt down beside the bed for a moment, holding the candle to the dying woman's face. She opened her eyes and muttered drowsily,
Who's you? Get out.
But then she seemed to grasp the situation again, and she started up with a shrill yell which made the hearers shudder, it was so weird and eerie.
My money!
She yelled, clasping the pillow in her skinny arms.
It's all mine. Ye shan't have it, cuss ye.
The doctor arose from his knees and shrugged his shoulders.
Not worth while doing anything,
he said coolly.
She'll be dead soon.
The old woman, mumbling over her pillow, caught the word and burst into tears.
Dead! Dead! My poor Rosanna, with her golden hair, always loving her poor mother till he took her away, and she came back to die. Oh!
Her voice died away in a long melancholy wail that made the two girls in the corner shiver and put their fingers in their ears.
My good woman,
said the doctor, bending over the bed,
would you not like to see a minister?
She looked at him with her bright, beady eyes, already somewhat dimmed with the mists of death, and said in a harsh, low whisper,
Why?
Because you have only a short time to live,
said the doctor gently.
You are dying.
Mother Guttersnipe sprang up and seized his arm with a scream of terror.
Dying! Dying! No! No!
She wailed, clawing his sleeve.
I ain't fit to die. Cuss me. Save me. Save me. I don't know where I'd go to. S'help me. Save me.
The doctor tried to remove her hands, but she held on with wonderful tenacity.
It is impossible,
he said briefly. The hag fell back in her bed.
I'll give you money to save me,
she shrieked.
Good money. All mine. All mine. See, here, sovereigns.
And tearing her pillow open, she took out a canvas bag, and from it poured a gleaming stream of gold. Gold, gold, it rolled all over the bed, over the floor, away into the dark corners, yet no one touched it, so enchained were they by the horrible spectacle of the dying woman clinging to life. She clutched some of the shining pieces and held them up to the three men as they stood silently beside the bed, but her hands trembled so that sovereigns kept falling from them on the floor with metallic clinks.
All mine! All mine!
She shrieked loudly.
Give me my life! Gold! Money! Cuss ye! I sold my soul for it! Save me! Give me my life!
And with trembling hands she tried to force the gold on them. They said no word, but stood silently looking at her, while the two girls in the corner clung together and trembled with fear.
Don't look at me! Don't!
cried the hag, falling down again amid the shining gold.
Ye want me to die! I shan't! I shan't! Give me my gold!
Clawing at the scattered sovereigns.
I'll take it with me! I shan't die.
Whimpering.
I ain't done nothing. Let me live. Give me a Bible. Save me. Cuss it.
She fell back on the bed, a corpse. The faint light of the candle flickered on the shining gold and on the dead face framed in tangled white hair, while the three men, sick at heart, turned away in silence to seek assistance with that wild cry still ringing in their ears.
Save me!
End of chapter 27. Chapter 28 of The Mystery of a Hansom Cab by Fergus Hume. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 28. Mark Frettlby as a Visitor. According to the copybooks of our youth, procrastination is the thief of time. Now Brian found the truth of this. He had been in town almost a week, but he had not yet been to see Calton. Each morning, or something very near it, he set out, determined to go direct to Chancery Lane, but he never arrived there. He had returned to his lodgings in East Melbourne, and had passed his time either in the house or in the garden. When, perhaps, business connected with the sale of his station compelled his presence in town, he drove straight there and back. Curiously enough, he shrank from meeting any of his friends. He felt keenly his recent position in the prisoner's dock, and even when walking by the Yarra, as he frequently did, he was conscious of an uneasy feeling, a feeling that he was an object of curiosity, and that people turned to look at him out of a morbid desire to see one who had been so nearly hanged for murder. As soon as his station should be sold and he married to Madge, he determined to leave Australia and never set foot on it again. But until he could leave the place, he would see no one, nor would he mix with his former friends, so great was his dread of being stared at. Mrs. Sampson, who had welcomed him back with shrill exclamations of delight, was loud in her expressions of disappointment as to the way he was shutting himself up.
"Your eyes being hollow,"
said the sympathising Cricket.
"It is natural as it's want of air, which my husband's uncle, being a druggist and well-to-do in Collingswood, says as our want of oxygen, being a French name, as he called the atmosphere, were fearful for pulling people down and making 'em go off their food, which you hardly eats anything, and not being a butterfly, it's expected as your appetite would be larger."
"Oh, I'm all right,"
said Brian, absently lighting a cigarette and only half listening to his landlady's garrulous chatter.
"But if anyone calls, tell them I'm not in. I don't want to be bothered by visitors."
"Being as wise a thing as Solomon ever said,"
answered Mrs. Sampson energetically.
"which, no doubt, he was in good health when seeing the Queen of Sheba, as is necessary when anyone calls, and not feeling disposed to speak, which I'm often that way myself on occasions, my spirits being low, as I've heard tell soda water have that effect on 'em, which you takes it with a dash of brandy, though to be sure that might be the cause of your want of life. And drat that bell,"
she finished, hurrying out of the room as the front doorbell sounded,
"which my legs is a giving way under me through being overworked."
Meanwhile, Brian sat and smoked contentedly, much relieved by the departure of Mrs. Sampson with her constant chatter. But he soon heard her mount the stairs again, and she entered the room with a telegram, which she handed to her lodger.
"Hoping it don't contain bad news,"
she said as she retreated to the door again.
"which I don't like 'em having. Had a shocking early life, through one having come unexpected, as my uncle's grandfather were dead, having perished of consumption, our family all being disposed to the disease. And now, if you'll excuse me, sir, I'll get to my dinner, being in the habit of taking me meals regular, and I studies my inside carefully, being easily upset, to which I never could be a sailor."
Mrs. Sampson, having at last exhausted herself, went out of the room and crackled loudly down the stairs, leaving Brian to read his telegram. He tore open the envelope and found the message was from Madge, to say that they had returned and to ask him to dine with them that evening. Fitzgerald folded up the telegram, then, rising from his seat, he walked moodily up and down the room with his hands in his pockets.
"So he is there,"
said the young man aloud,
"and I shall have to meet him and shake hands with him, knowing all the time what he is. If it were not for Madge, I'd leave this place at once. But after the way she stood by me in my trouble, I should be a coward if I did so."
It was as Madge had predicted. Her father was unable to stay long in one place, and had come back to Melbourne a week after Brian had arrived. The pleasant party at the station was broken up, and, like the graves of a household, the guests were scattered far and wide. Peterson had left for New Zealand, en route for the wonders of the hot lakes, and the old colonist was about to start for England in order to refresh his boyish memories. Mr. and Mrs. Rolleston had come back to Melbourne, where the wretched Felix was compelled once more to plunge into politics, and Dr. Chinston had resumed his usual routine of fees and patients. Madge was glad to be back in Melbourne again, as now that her health was restored, she craved for the excitement of town life. It was now more than 3 months since the murder, and the 9 days' wonder was a thing of the past. The possibility of a war with Russia was the one absorbing topic of the hour, and the colonists were busy preparing for the attack of a possible enemy. As the Spanish kings had drawn their treasure from Mexico and Peru, so might the White Tsar lay violent hands on the golden stores of Australia. But here there were no uncultured savages to face, but the sons and grandsons of men who had dimmed the glories of the Russian arms at Alma and Balaclava. So, in the midst of stormy rumours of war, the tragic fate of Oliver White was quite forgotten. After the trial, everyone, including the detective office, had given up the matter and mentally relegated it to the list of undiscovered crimes. In spite of the utmost vigilance, nothing new had been discovered, and it seemed likely that the assassin of Oliver White would remain a free man. There were only two people in Melbourne who still held the contrary opinion, and they were Calton and Kilsip. Both these men had sworn to discover this unknown murderer, who struck his cowardly blow in the dark, and though there seemed no possible chance of success, yet they worked on. Kilsip suspected Roger Morland, the boon companion of the dead man, but his suspicions were vague and uncertain, and there seemed little hope of verifying them. The barrister did not as yet suspect any particular person, though the deathbed confession of Mother Guttersnipe had thrown a new light on the subject. But he thought that when Fitzgerald told him the secret which Rosanna Moore had confided to his keeping, the real murderer would soon be discovered, or at least some clue would be found that would lead to his detection. So, as the matter stood at the time of Mark Frettlby's return to Melbourne, Mr. Calton was waiting for Fitzgerald's confession before making a move, while Kilsip worked stealthily in the dark, searching for evidence against Morland. On receiving Madge's telegram, Brian determined to go down in the evening, but not to dinner, so he sent a reply to Madge to that effect. He did not want to meet Mark Frettlby, but did not of course tell this to Madge, so she had her dinner by herself, as her father had gone to his club, and the time of his return was uncertain. After dinner she wrapped a light cloak round her and repaired to the veranda to wait for her lover. The garden looked charming in the moonlight, with the black, dense cypress trees standing up against the sky, and the great fountain splashing cool and silvery. There was a heavily foliaged oak by the gate, and she strolled down the path and stood under it in the shadow, listening to the whisper and rustle of its multitudinous leaves. It is curious the unearthly glamour which moonlight seems to throw over everything, and though Madge knew every flower, tree, and shrub in the garden, yet they all looked weird and fantastical in the cold white light. She went up to the fountain, and, seating herself on the edge, amused herself by dipping her hand into the chilly water and letting it fall like silver rain back into the basin. Then she heard the iron gate open and shut with a clash, and springing to her feet, saw someone coming up the path in a light coat and soft, wide-awake hat.
"Oh, it's you at last, Brian,"
she cried as she ran down the path to meet him.
"Why did you not come before?"
Not being Brian, I can't say,
answered her father's voice. Madge burst out laughing.
What an absurd mistake,"
she cried.
"Why, I thought you were Brian."
Indeed.
"Yes, in that hat and coat I couldn't tell the difference in the moonlight."
Oh,
said her father with a laugh, pushing his hat back.
Moonlight is necessary to complete the spell, I suppose?
"Of course,"
answered his daughter.
"If there was no moonlight, alas for lovers."
Alas, indeed,
echoed her father.
They would become as extinct as the moa. But where are your eyes, Puss, when you take an old man like me for your gay young Lochinvar?
"Well, really, Papa,"
answered Madge deprecatingly.
"you do look so like him in that coat and hat that I could not tell the difference till you spoke."
Nonsense, child,
said Mr. Frettlby roughly.
You are fanciful.
And turning on his heel, he walked rapidly towards the house, leaving Madge staring after him in astonishment, as well she might, for her father had never spoken to her so roughly before. Wondering at the cause of his sudden anger, she stood spellbound, until there came a step behind her and a soft, low whistle. She turned with a scream and saw Brian smiling at her.
"Oh, it's you,"
she said with a pout as he caught her in his arms and kissed her.
"Only me,"
said Brian ungrammatically.
"Disappointing, isn't it?"
Oh, fearfully,
answered the girl with a gay laugh, as arm in arm they walked towards the house.
But do you know, I made such a curious mistake just now. I thought Papa was you.
How strange,
said Brian absently, for indeed he was admiring her charming face, which looked so pure and sweet in the moonlight.
Yes, wasn't it?
She replied.
He had on a light coat and a soft hat, just like you wear sometimes, and as you are both the same height, I took you for one another.
Brian did not answer, but there was a cold feeling at his heart as he saw a possibility of his worst suspicion being confirmed. For just at that moment there came into his mind the curious coincidence of the man who got into the hansom cab being dressed similarly to himself. What if—
Nonsense,
he said aloud, rousing himself out of the train of thought the resemblance had suggested.
I'm sure it isn't,
said Madge, who had been talking about something else for the last 5 minutes.
You are a very rude young man.
I beg your pardon?
Said Brian, waking up.
You were saying?
That the horse is the most noble of all animals. Exactly.
I don't understand,
began Brian, rather puzzled.
Of course you don't,
interrupted Madge petulantly.
Considering I've been wasting my eloquence on a deaf man for the last 10 minutes, and very likely lame as well as deaf.
And to prove the truth of the remark, she ran up the path with Brian after her. He had a long chase of it, for Madge was nimble and better acquainted with the garden than he was, but at last he caught her just as she was running up the steps into the house, and then— history repeats itself. They went into the drawing-room and found that Mr. Frettlby had gone up to his study and did not want to be disturbed. Madge sat down to the piano, but before she struck a note, Brian took both her hands prisoners.
Madge,
he said gravely as she turned round.
What did your father say when you made that mistake?
He was very angry,
she answered.
Quite cross. I'm sure I don't know why.
Brian sighed as he released her hands, and was about to reply when the visitor's bell sounded. They heard the servant answer it, and then someone was taken upstairs to Mr. Frettlby's study. When the footman came in to light the gas, Madge asked who it was that had come to the door.
I dunno, miss,
he answered.
He said he wanted to see Mr. Frettlby particularly, so I took him up to the study.
But I thought that Papa said he was not to be disturbed.
Yes, miss, but the gentleman had an appointment with him.
Poor Papa,
sighed Madge, turning again to the piano.
He has always got such a lot to do.
Left to themselves, Madge began playing Waldteuffel's Last New Waltz, a dreamy, haunting melody with a touch of sadness in it, and Brian, lying lazily on the sofa, listened. Then she sang a gay little French song about love and a butterfly, with a mocking refrain which made Brian laugh.
A memory of Offenbach,
he said, rising and coming over to the piano.
We certainly can't approach the French in writing these airy trifles.
They're unsatisfactory, I think,
said Madge, running her fingers over the keys.
They mean nothing.
Of course not,
he replied.
But don't you remember that De Quincey says there is no moral either big or little in the Iliad?
Well, I think there's more music in Barbara Allen than all those frothy things,
said Madge with fine scorn.
Come and sing it.
A 5-act funeral it is,
groaned Brian as he rose to obey.
Let's have Gary Owen instead.
Nothing else, however, would suit the capricious young person at the piano, so Brian, who had a pleasant voice, sang the quaint old ditty of a cruel Barbara Allen who treated her dying love with such disdain.
Sir John Graham was an ass,
said Brian when he had finished.
Or, instead of dying in such a silly manner, he'd have married her right off without asking her permission.
I don't think she was worth marrying,
replied Madge, opening a book of Mendelssohn's duets.
Well, she wouldn't have made such a fuss over her health, not being drunk.
Depend upon it, she was a plain woman,
remarked Brian gravely.
And was angry because she wasn't toasted among the rest of the country belles. I think the young man had a narrow escape. She'd always have reminded him about that unfortunate oversight.
You seem to have analysed her nature pretty well,
said Madge a little dryly.
However, we'll leave the failings of Barbara Allen alone and sing this.
This was Mendelssohn's charming duet, Would That My Love, which was a great favourite of Brian's. They were in the middle of it when suddenly Madge stopped as she heard a loud cry, evidently proceeding from her father's study. Recollecting Dr. Chinston's warning, she ran out of the room and upstairs, leaving Brian rather puzzled by her unceremonious departure, for though he had heard the cry, yet he did not attach much importance to it. Madge knocked at the study door, and then she tried to open it, but it was locked.
"Who's there?"
asked her father sharply from inside.
Only me, Papa,
she answered.
I thought you were...
No, I'm all right,
replied her father quickly.
Go downstairs. I'll join you shortly.
Madge went back to the drawing-room, only half satisfied with the explanation. She found Brian waiting at the door with rather an anxious face.
What's the matter?
he asked as she paused a moment at the foot of the stairs.
Papa says nothing,
she replied.
But I am sure he must have been startled, or he would not have cried out like that.
She told him what Dr. Chinston had said about the state of her father's heart, a recital which shocked Brian greatly. They did not return to the drawing-room, but went out on the veranda, where, after wrapping a cloak around Madge, Fitzgerald lit a cigarette. They sat down at the far end of the veranda, somewhat in the shadow, and could see the hall door wide open, and a warm flood of mellow light pouring therefrom, and beyond the cold white moonshine. After about a quarter of an hour, Madge's alarm about her father having somewhat subsided, they were chatting on in different subjects when a man came out of the hall door and paused for a moment on the steps of the veranda. He was dressed in rather a fashionable suit of clothes, but in spite of the heat of the night he had a thick white scarf round his throat.
That's a rather cool individual,
said Brian, removing his cigarette from between his lips.
I wonder what? Good God!
he cried, rising to his feet as the stranger turned round to look at the house and took off his hat for a moment.
Roger Morland!
The man started and looked quickly round into the dark shadows of the veranda where they were seated. Then, putting on his hat, he ran quickly down the path, and they heard the gate clang after him. Madge felt a sudden fear at the expression on Brian's face, as revealed by a ray of moonlight streaming full on it.
Who is Roger Morland?
she asked, touching his arm.
Oh, I remember.
With sudden horror.
Oliver White's friend.
Yes?
In a hoarse whisper.
And one of the witnesses at the trial.
End of chapter 28. Chapter 29 of The Mystery of a Hansom Cab by Fergus Hume. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 29. Mr. Calton's curiosity is satisfied. There was not much sleep for Brian that night. He left Madge almost immediately and went home, but he did not go to bed. He felt too anxious and ill at ease to sleep, and passed the greater part of the night walking up and down his room, occupied with his own sad thoughts. He was wondering in his own mind what could be the meaning of Roger Morland's visit to Mark Frettlby. All the evidence that he had given at the trial was that he had met White and had been drinking with him during the evening. White then went out, and that was the last Morland had seen of him. Now the question was, what did he go to see Mark Frettlby for? He had no acquaintance with him, and yet he called by appointment. It is true he might have been in poverty, and the millionaire being well known as an extremely generous man, Morland might have called on him for money. But then the cry which Frettlby had given after the interview had lasted a short time proved that he had been startled. Madge had gone upstairs and found the door locked, her father refusing her admission. Now why was he so anxious Morland should not be seen by anyone? That he had made some startling revelation was certain, and Fitzgerald felt sure that it was in connection with the Hansom Cab murder case. He wearied himself with conjectures about the matter, and towards daybreak threw himself, dressed as he was, on the bed, and slept heavily till 12 o'clock the next day. When he arose and looked at himself in the glass, he was startled at the haggard and worn appearance of his face. The moment he was awake, his mind went back to Mark Frettlby and the visit of Roger Morland.
The net is closing round him,
he murmured to himself.
I don't see how he can escape. Oh, Madge, if only I could spare you the bitterness of knowing what you must know, sooner or later, and that unhappy girl. The sins of the fathers will be visited on the children. God help them.
He took his bath and after dressing himself went into his sitting room where he had a cup of tea, which refreshed him considerably. Mrs. Sampson came crackling merrily upstairs with a letter and gave vent to an exclamation of surprise on seeing his altered appearance.
"Lor, sir,"
she exclaimed.
"what have you been a-doing? Me knowing your habits, knowed as you'd gone to bed. Not to say as it's very tempting in this hot weather, but with excuses, sir, you looks as if you hadn't slept a blessed wink."
No more I have,
said Brian, listlessly holding out his hand for the letter.
I was walking up and down my room all last night. I must have walked miles.
"Ah, how that puts me in mind of my poor husband,"
chirped the cricket.
"Being a printer and accustomed like a howl to the darkness, when he was home for the night, he walked up and down till he wore out the carpet, being an expensive one, as I had on my marriage, and the only way I could stop him was by giving him something soothing, which you, sir, ought to try. Whiskey hot with lemon and sugar. But I've heard tell us chloroform."
No, duh it,
said Brian, hastily startled out of his politeness.
I've had enough of that.
"Aching teeth, no doubt,"
said the landlady, going to the door.
"Which I'm often taken that way myself. Decayed teeth running in the family. Though, to be sure, mine are stronger than former. A lodger of mine having been a dentist, and doing them beautiful. Instead of paying rent, not having ready cash, his boxes being filled with bricks on his departure from the house."
As Brian did not appear particularly interested in these domestic reminiscences and seemed as if he wanted to be let alone, Mrs. Sampson, with a final crackle, went downstairs and talked to the neighbour in the kitchen as to the desirability of drawing her money out of the savings bank in case the Russians should surprise and capture Melbourne. Brian, left alone, stared out of the window at the dusty road and the black shadows cast by the tall poplars in front of the house.
I must leave this place,
he said to himself.
Every chance remark seems to bear on the murder, and I'm not anxious to have it constantly by my side like a skeleton at the feast.
Suddenly he recollected the letter which he held in his hand, and which he now looked at for the first time. It proved to be from Madge, and, tearing it open hastily, he read it.
"I cannot understand what is the matter with Papa,"
she wrote.
"Ever since that man Morland left last night, he has shut himself up in his study, and is writing there hour after hour. I went up this morning, but he would not let me in. He did not come down to breakfast, and I am getting seriously alarmed. Come down tomorrow and see me, for I am anxious about his state of health, and I am sure that Morland told him something which has upset him."
Writing,
said Brian as he put the letter in his pocket.
What about, I wonder? Perhaps he is thinking of committing suicide. If so, I, for one, will not stop him. It is a horrible thing to do, but it would be acting for the best under the circumstances.
In spite of his determination to seek Calton and tell all, Fitzgerald did not go near him that day. He felt ill and weary, the want of sleep and mental worry telling on him terribly, and he looked 10 years older than he did before the murder of White. It is trouble which draws lines on the smooth forehead and furrows round the mouth. If a man has any mental worry, his life becomes a positive agony to him. Mental tortures are quite as bad as physical ones, if not worse. The last thing before dropping off to sleep is the thought of trouble, and with the first faint light of dawn it returns and hammers all day at the weary brain. But while a man can sleep, life is rendered at least endurable, and of all the blessings which Providence has bestowed, there is none so precious as that same sleep, which, as wise Sancho Panza says,
wraps every man like a cloak.
Brian felt the need of rest, so sending a telegram to Calton to call on him in the morning, and another to Madge that he would be down to luncheon next day, he stayed indoors all day, and amused himself with smoking and reading. He went to bed early, and succeeded in having a sound sleep, so when he awoke next morning he felt considerably refreshed and invigorated. He was having his breakfast at 8:30 when he heard the sound of wheels, and immediately afterwards a ring at the bell. He went to the window and saw Calton's trap was at the door. The owner was shortly afterwards shown into the room.
"Well, you are a nice fellow,"
cried Calton after greetings were over.
"Here I've been waiting for you with all the patience of Job, thinking you were still up country."
Will you have some breakfast?
asked Brian, laughing at his indignation.
"What have you got?"
said Calton, looking over the table.
"Ham and eggs. Your landlady's culinary ideas are very limited."
Most landladies' ideas are,
retorted Fitzgerald, resuming his breakfast.
Unless heaven invents some new animal, lodgers will go on getting beef and mutton, alternated with hash, until the end of the world.
"When one is in Rome, one mustn't speak ill of the Pope,"
answered Calton with a grimace.
"Do you think your landlady could supply me with brandy and soda?"
I think so,
answered Fitzgerald, rising and ringing the bell.
But isn't it rather early for that sort of thing?
"There's a proverb about glass houses,"
said Calton severely,
"which applies to you in this particular instance."
Whereupon Fitzgerald laughed, and Calton, having been supplied with what he required, prepared to talk business.
"I need hardly tell you how anxious I am to hear what you've got to say,"
he said, leaning back in his chair.
"but I may as well tell you that I am satisfied that I know half your secret already."
Indeed.
Fitzgerald looked astonished.
In that case I need not.
"Yes, you need,"
retorted Calton.
"I told you I only know half."
Which half?
Rather difficult to answer. However, I'll tell you what I know, and you can supply all deficiencies. I'm quite ready. Go on. Stop."
He arose and closed the door carefully.
"Well?"
resuming his seat.
"Mother Guttersnipe died the other night."
Is she dead?
"As a doornail,"
answered Calton calmly.
"And a horrible deathbed it was. Her screams ring in my ears yet. But before she died she sent for me and said—"
What?
"That she was the mother of Rosanna Moore."
Yes.
"And that Sal Rawlins was Rosanna's child."
And the father,
said Brian in a low voice,
"Was Mark Frettlby."
Ah.
"And now what have you to tell me?"
Nothing.
"Nothing?"
echoed Calton, surprised.
"Then this is what Rosanna Moore told you when she died?"
Yes.
"Then why have you made such a mystery about it?"
You ask that?
said Fitzgerald, looking up in surprise.
If I had told it, don't you see what difference it would have made to Madge?
"I'm sure I don't,"
retorted the barrister, completely mystified.
"I suppose you mean Frettlby's connection with Rosanna Moore. Well, of course, it was not a very creditable thing for her to have been Frettlby's mistress, but still—"
His mistress,
said Fitzgerald, looking up sharply.
Then you don't know all.
"What do you mean? Was she not his mistress?"
No, his wife.
Calton sprang to his feet and gave a cry of surprise.
"His wife?"
Fitzgerald nodded.
"Why, Mother Guttersnipe did not know this. She thought Rosanna was his mistress."
He kept his marriage secret,
answered Brian.
And his wife ran away with someone else shortly afterwards. He never revealed it.
"I understand now,"
said the barrister slowly.
"For if Mark Frettlby was lawfully married to Rosanna Moore, Madge is illegitimate."
Yes, and now she occupies the place which Sal Rawlins, or rather Sal Frettlby, ought to.
"Poor girl,"
said Calton a little sadly.
But all this does not explain the mystery of White's murder.
I will tell you that,
said Fitzgerald quickly.
When Rosanna left her husband, she ran away to England with some young fellow. And when he got tired of her, she returned to the stage and became famous as a burlesque actress under the name of Musette. There she met White, as your friend found out, and they came out here for the purpose of extorting money from Frettlby. When they arrived in Melbourne, Rosanna let White do all the business and kept herself quiet. She gave her marriage certificate to White, and he had it on him the night he was murdered.
Then Gorby was right,
interposed Calton eagerly.
The man to whom those papers were valuable did murder White.
Can you doubt it? And that man was?
Not Mark Frettlby,
burst out Calton.
Surely not Mark Frettlby.
Brian nodded.
Yes, Mark Frettlby.
There was a silence for a few moments, Calton being too much startled by the revelation to say anything.
When did you discover this?
He asked after a pause.
At the time you first came to see me in prison,
said Brian.
I had no suspicion till then, but when you said that White was murdered for the sake of certain papers, I, knowing full well that they were, and to whom they were of value, guessed immediately that Mark Frettlby had killed White in order to obtain them and keep his secret.
There can be no doubt of it,
said the barrister with a sigh.
So this is the reason Frettlby wanted Madge to marry White. Her hand was to be the price of his silence. When he withdrew his consent, White threatened him with exposure. I remember he left the house in a very excited state on the night he was murdered. Frettlby must have followed him up to town, got into the cab with him, and after killing him with chloroform, must have taken the marriage certificate from his secret pocket and escaped.
Brian rose to his feet and walked rapidly up and down the room.
Now you can understand what a hell my life has been for the last few months,
he said.
Knowing that he had committed the crime, and yet I had to sit with him, eat with him, and drink with him with the knowledge that he was a murderer, and Madge his daughter.
Just then a knock came to his door, and Mrs. Sampson entered with a telegram which he handed to Brian. He tore it open as she withdrew, and glancing over it, gave a cry of horror and let it flutter to his feet. Calton turned rapidly on hearing his cry, and seeing him fall into a chair with a white face, snatched up the telegram and read it. When he did so, his face grew as pale and startled as Fitzgerald, and lifting his hand, he said solemnly,
"It is the judgment of God."
End of chapter 29. Chapter 30 of The Mystery of a Hansom Cab by Fergus Hume. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 30. Nemesis. Men, according to the old Greek, are the sport of the gods, who, enthroned on high Olympus, put evil desires into the hearts of mortals, and when evil actions were the outcome of evil thoughts, amused themselves by watching the ineffectual efforts made by their victims to escape a relentless deity called Nemesis, who exacted a penalty for their evil deeds. It was no doubt very amusing to the gods, but it is questionable if the men found it so. They had their revenge, however, for weary of plaguing puny mortals who whimpered and cried when they saw they could not escape, the inevitable Nemesis turned her attention from actors to spectators and made a clean sweep of the whole Olympian hierarchy. She smashed their affairs, pulled down their statues, and after she had completed her malicious work, found that she had, vulgarly speaking, been cutting off her nose to spite her face, for she too became an object of derision and of disbelief, and was forced to retire to the same obscurity to which she had relegated the other deities. But men found out that she had not been altogether useless as a scapegoat upon which to lay the blame of their own shortcomings. So they created a new deity called Fate, and laid any misfortune which happened to them to her charge. Her worship is still very popular, especially among lazy and unlucky people who never bestir themselves, on the ground that whether they do so or not, their lives are already settled by Fate. After all, the true religion of Fate has been preached by George Eliot when she says that our lives are the outcome of our actions, Set up any idol you please upon which to lay the blame of unhappy lives and baffle ambitions, but the true cause is to be found in men themselves. Every action, good or bad, which we do has its corresponding reward, and Mark Frettlby found it so, for the sins of his youth were now being punished in his old age. No doubt he had sinned gaily enough in that far-off time when life's cup was still brimming with wine and no asp hid among the roses. But Nemesis had been an unseen spectator of all his thoughtless actions, and now she came to demand her just dues. He felt somewhat as Faust must have felt when Mephistopheles suggested a visit to Hades, in repayment of those years of magic youth and magic power. So long ago it seemed since he had married Rosanna Moore that he almost persuaded himself that it had been only a dream, a pleasant dream with a disagreeable awakening. When she had left him, he had tried to forget her, recognizing how unworthy she was of a good man's love. He heard that she had died in a London hospital, and with a passionate sigh for a perished love, he had dismissed her from his thoughts forever. His second marriage had turned out a happy one, and he regretted the death of his wife deeply. Afterwards, all his love centred on his daughter, and he thought he would be able to spend his declining years in peace. This, however, was not to be, and he was thunderstruck when White arrived from England with the information that his first wife still lived, and that the daughter of his second was illegitimate. Sooner than risk exposure, Frettlby agreed to anything, but White's demands became too exorbitant, and he refused to comply with them. On White's death he again breathed freely, when suddenly a second possessor of his fatal secret started up in the person of Roger Morland. As the murder of Duncan had to be followed by that of Banquo in order to render Macbeth safe, so he foresaw that while Roger Morland lived, his life would be one long misery. He knew that the friend of the murdered man would be his master and would never leave him during his life, while after his death he would probably publish the whole ghastly story and defame the memory of the widely respected Mark Frettlby. What is it that Shakespeare says?
Good name in man or woman is the immediate jewel of their souls.
And after all these years of spotless living and generous use of his wealth, was he to be dragged down to the depths of infamy and degradation by a man like Morland? Already in fancy he heard the jeering cries of his fellow men, and saw the finger of scorn point at him. He, the great Mark Frettlby, famous throughout Australia for his honesty, integrity, and generosity. No, it could not be, and yet this would surely happen unless he took means to prevent it. The day after he had seen Morland and knew that his secret was no longer safe, since it was in the power of a man who might reveal it at any moment in a drunken fit or out of sheer maliciousness, he sat at his desk writing. After a time he laid down his pen, and taking up a portrait of his dead wife which stood just in front of him, he stared at it long and earnestly. As he did so, his mind went back to the time when he had first met and loved her. Even as Faust had entered into the purity and serenity of Gretchen's chamber out of the coarseness and profligacy of Auerbach's cellar, so he, leaving behind him the wild life of his youth, had entered into the peace and quiet of a domestic home. The old feverish life with Rosanna Moore seemed to be as unsubstantial and chimerical as no doubt his union with Lilith after he met Eve seemed to Adam in the old rabbinical legend. There seemed to be only one way open to him, by which he could escape the relentless fate which dogged his steps. He would write a confession of everything from the time he had first met Rosanna, and then death. He would cut the Gordian knot of all his difficulties, and then his secret would be safe. Safe? No, it could not be while Morland lived. When he was dead, Morland would see Madge and embitter her life with the story of her father's sins. Yes, he must live to protect her, and drag his weary chain of bitter remembrance through life, always with that terrible sword of Damocles hanging over him. But still, he would write out his confession, and after his death, whenever it may happen, it might help, if not altogether to exculpate, at least to secure some pity for a man who had been hardly dealt with by fate. His resolution taken, he put it into force at once, and sat all day at his desk, filling page after page with the history of his past life, which was so bitter to him. He started at first languidly, and as in the performance of an unpleasant but necessary duty. Soon, however, he became interested in it, and took a peculiar pleasure in putting down every minute circumstance which made the case stronger against himself. He dealt with it not as a criminal, but as a prosecutor, and painted his conduct as much blacker than it really had been. Towards the end of the day, however, after reading over the earlier sheets, he experienced a revulsion of feeling, seeing how severe he had been on himself. So he wrote a defence of his conduct, showing that fate had been too strong for him. It was a weak argument to bring forward, but still he felt it was the only one that he could make. It was quite dark when he had finished, and while sitting in the twilight looking dreamily at the sheets scattered all over his desk, he heard a knock at the door and his daughter's voice asking if he was coming to dinner. All day long he had closed his door against everyone, but now his task being ended, he collected all the closely written sheets together, placed them in the drawer of his escritoire, which he locked, and then opened the door.
"Dear papa!"
cried Madge as she entered rapidly and threw her arms round his neck.
"What have you been doing here all day by yourself?"
"Writing,"
returned her father laconically, as he gently removed her arms.
"Why, I thought you were ill,"
she answered, looking at him apprehensively.
"No, dear,"
he replied quietly.
"Not ill, but worried."
"I knew that dreadful man who came last night had told you something to worry you. Who is he?"
"Oh, a friend of mine,"
answered Frettlby with hesitation.
"What, Roger Morland?"
Her father started.
"How do you know it was Roger Morland?"
"Oh, Brian recognised him as he went out."
Mark Frettlby hesitated for a few moments, and then busied himself with the papers on his desk as he replied in a low voice.
"You are right. It was Roger Morland. He is very hard up, and as he was a friend of poor White's, he asked me to assist him, which I did."
He hated to hear himself telling such a deliberate falsehood, but there was no help for it. Madge must never know the truth so long as he could conceal it.
"Just like you,"
said Madge, kissing him lightly with filial pride.
"The best and kindest of men."
He shivered slightly as he felt her caress, and thought how she would recoil from him did she know all.
After all,
says some cynical writer,
the illusions of youth are mostly due to want of experience.
Madge, ignorant in a great measure of the world, cherished her pleasant illusions, though many of them had been destroyed by the trials of the past year, and her father longed to keep her in this frame of mind.
"Now go down to dinner, my dear,"
he said, leading her to the door.
"I will follow soon."
"Don't be long,"
replied his daughter,
"or I shall come up again."
And she ran down the stairs, her heart feeling strangely light. Her father looked after her until she vanished, then, heaving a regretful sigh, returned to his study, and taking out the scattered papers, fastened them together and endorsed them.
"My confession."
He then placed them in an envelope, sealed it, and put it back in the desk.
"If all that is in that packet were known,"
he said aloud as he left the room,
"what would the world say?"
That night he was singularly brilliant at the dinner-table. Generally a very reticent and grave man, on this night he laughed and talked so gaily that the very servants noticed the change. The fact was, he felt a sense of relief at having unburdened his mind, and felt as though, by writing out that confession, he had laid the spectre which had haunted him for so long. His daughter was delighted at the change in his spirits, but the old Scotch nurse, who had been in the house since Madge was a baby, shook her head.
"He's fair,"
she said gravely.
"He's not long for this world."
Of course she was laughed at. People who believe in presentiments generally are, but nevertheless she held firmly to her opinion. Mr. Frettlby went to bed early that night, the excitement of the last few days and the feverish gaiety in which he had lately indulged proving too strong for him. No sooner had he laid his head on his pillow than he dropped off to sleep at once, and forgot in placid slumber the troubles and worries of his waking hours. It was only 9 o'clock, so Madge stayed by herself in the great drawing-room, and read a new novel which was then creating a sensation, called Sweet Violet Eyes. It belied its reputation, however, for it was very soon thrown on the table with a look of disgust. And rising from her seat, Madge walked up and down the room, and wished some good fairy would hint to Brian that he was wanted. If man is a gregarious animal, how much more, then, is a woman? This is not a conundrum, but a simple truth.
A female Robinson Crusoe,
says a writer who prided himself upon being a keen observer of human nature.
A female Robinson Crusoe would have gone mad for want of something to talk to.
This remark, though severe, nevertheless contains several grains of truth, for women as a rule talk more than men. They are more sociable, and a Miss Misanthrope, in spite of Justin McCarthy's, is unknown, at least in civilized communities. Miss Frettlby, being neither misanthropic nor dumb, began to long for someone to talk to, and, ringing the bell, ordered Sal to be sent in. The two girls had become great friends, and Madge, though by 2 years the younger, assumed the role of mentor, and under her guidance Sal was rapidly improving. It was a strange irony of fate which brought together these two children of the same father, each with such different histories, the one reared in luxury and affluence, never having known want, and the other dragged up in the gutter, all unsexed and besmirched by the life she had led. The whirligig of time brings in its revenges, and it was the last thing in the world Mark Frettlby would have thought of seeing. Rosanna Moore's child, whom he fancied dead, under the same roof as his daughter Madge. On receiving Madge's message, Sal came to the drawing-room, and the two were soon chatting amicably together. The room was almost in darkness, only one lamp being lighted. Mr. Frettlby very sensibly detested gas with its glaring light, and had nothing but lamps in his drawing-room. At the end of the apartment, where Sal and Madge were seated, there was a small table. On it stood a large lamp with an opaque globe, which, having a shade over it, threw a soft and subdued circle of light round the table, leaving the rest of the room in a kind of semi-darkness. Near this sat Madge and Sal, talking gaily, and away on the left-hand side they could see the door open, and a warm flood of light pouring in from the hall. They had been talking together for some time, when Sal's quick ear caught a footfall on the soft carpet, and turning rapidly, she saw a tall figure advancing down the room. Madge saw it too, and started up in surprise on recognizing her father. He was clothed in his dressing-gown, and carried some papers in his hand.
"Why, Papa,"
said Madge in surprise.
Hush,
whispered Sal, grasping her arms.
He's asleep.
And so he was. In accordance with the dictates of the excited brain, the weary body had risen from the bed and wandered about the house. The two girls, drawing back into the shadow, watched him with bated breath as he came slowly down the room. In a few moments he was within the circle of light, and, moving noiselessly along, he laid the papers he carried on the table. They were in a large blue envelope, much worn, with writing in red ink on it. Sal recognized it at once as the one she had seen in the possession of the dead woman, and with an instinctive feeling that there was something wrong, she tried to draw Madge back as she watched her father's action with an intensity of feeling which held her spellbound. Frettlby opened the envelope, and took therefrom a yellow, frayed piece of paper, which he spread out on the table. Madge bent forward to see it, but Sal, with a sudden terror, drew her back.
"For God's sake, no!"
she cried. But it was too late. Madge had caught sight of the names on the paper: Marriage, Rosanna Moore, Mark Frettlby. And the whole awful truth flashed upon her. These were the papers Rosanna Moore had handed to White. White had been murdered by the man to whom the papers were of value.
"Oh, my father!"
She staggered blindly forward, and then, with one piercing shriek, fell to the ground. In doing so, she struck against her father, who was still standing beside the table. Awakened suddenly with that wild cry in his ears, he opened his eyes wide, put out feeble hands as if to keep something back, and with a strangled cry he fell dead on the floor beside his daughter. Sal, horror-struck, did not lose her presence of mind, but, snatching the papers off the table, she thrust them in her pocket, and then called aloud for the servants. but they, already attracted by Madge's wild cry, came hurrying in to find Mark Frettlby, the millionaire, lying dead, and his daughter in a faint beside her father's corpse. End of chapter 30. Chapter 31 of The Mystery of a Hansom Cab by Fergus Hume. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 31. Hush Money. As soon as Brian received the telegram which announced the death of Mark Frettlby, he put on his hat, stepped into Calton's trap, and drove along to the St Kilda station in Flinders Street with that gentleman. There Calton dismissed his trap, sending a note to his clerk with the groom, and went down to St Kilda with Fitzgerald. On arrival they found the whole house perfectly quiet and orderly, owing to the excellent management of Sal Rawlins. She had taken the command in everything, and although the servants, knowing her antecedents, were disposed to resent her doing so, yet such were her administrative powers and strong will that they obeyed her implicitly. Mark Frettlby's body had been taken up to his bedroom. Madge had been put to bed, and Dr. Chinston and Brian sent for. When they arrived, they could not help expressing their admiration for the capital way in which Sal Rawlins had managed things.
"She's a clever girl, that,"
whispered Calton to Fitzgerald.
"Curious thing, she should have taken up her proper position in her father's house. Fate is a deal cleverer than we mortals think her."
Brian was about to reply when Dr. Chinston entered the room. His face was very grave, and Fitzgerald looked at him in alarm.
"Madge! Miss Frettlby!"
he faltered.
"Is very ill,"
replied the doctor.
"Has an attack of brain fever. I can't answer for the consequences yet."
Brian sat down on the sofa and stared at the doctor in a dazed sort of way. Madge dangerously ill, perhaps dying? What if she were to die, and he to lose the true-hearted woman who stood so nobly by him in his trouble?
"Cheer up,"
said Dr. Chinston, patting him on the shoulder.
"While there's life, there's hope, and whatever human aid can do to save her will be done."
Brian grasped the doctor's hand in silence, his heart being too full to speak.
"How did Frettlby die?"
asked Calton.
"Heart disease,"
said Chinston.
"His heart was very much affected, as I discovered a week or so ago. It appears he was walking in his sleep, and entering the drawing-room he alarmed Miss Frettlby, who screamed and must have touched him. He awoke suddenly, and the natural consequences followed. He dropped down dead."
"What alarmed Miss Frettlby?"
asked Brian in a low voice, covering his face with his hand.
"The sight of her father walking in his sleep, I suppose,"
said Chinston, buttoning his glove.
"And the shock of his death, which took place indirectly through her, accounts for the brain fever."
"Marge Frettlby is not the woman to scream and waken a somnambulist,"
said Calton decidedly.
"Knowing as she did the danger, there must be some other reason."
"This young woman will tell you all about it,"
said Chinston, nodding towards Sal, who entered the room at this moment.
"She was present, and since then has managed things admirably, and now I must go,"
he said, shaking hands with Calton and Fitzgerald.
"Keep up your heart, my boy. I'll pull her through yet."
After the doctor had gone, Calton turned sharply to Sal Rawlins, who stood waiting to be addressed.
"Well,"
he said briskly,
"can you tell us what startled Miss Frettlby?"
"I can, sir,"
she answered quietly.
"I was in the drawing-room when Mr. Frettlby died, but we had better go up to the study."
"Why?"
asked Calton in surprise, as he and Fitzgerald followed her upstairs.
"Because, sir,"
she said, when they had entered the study and she had locked the door,
"I don't want anyone but yourselves to know what I tell you."
"More mystery,"
muttered Calton as he glanced at Brian and took his seat at the escritoire.
"Mr. Frettlby went to bed early last night,"
said Sal calmly,
"and Miss Madge and I were talking together in the drawing-room when he entered, walking in his sleep, and carrying some papers.
Both Calton and Fitzgerald started, and the latter grew pale.
He came down the room and spread out a paper on the table where the lamp was. Miss Madge bent forward to see what it was. I tried to stop her, but it was too late. She gave a scream and fell on the floor. In doing so, she happened to touch her father. He awoke and fell down dead.
And the papers?
Asked Calton uneasily. Sal did not answer, but producing them from her pocket, laid them in his hands. Brian bent forward, and Calton opened the envelope in silence, but both gave vent to an excitement of horror at seeing the certificate of marriage which they knew Rosanna Moore had given to White. Their worst suspicions were confirmed, and Brian turned away his head, afraid to meet the barrister's eye. The latter folded up the papers thoughtfully and put them in his pocket.
You know what these are?
He asked Sal, eyeing her keenly.
I could hardly help knowing,
she answered.
It proves that Rosanna Moore was Mr. Frettlby's wife, and...
She hesitated.
Go on,
said Brian in a harsh tone, looking up.
And they were the papers she gave Mr. White.
Well?
Sal was silent for a moment, and then looked up with a flush.
You needn't think I'm going to spilt,
she said indignantly, recurring to her Burke Street slang and the excitement of the moment.
I know what you know, but I'll be as silent as the grave.
Thank you,
said Brian, fervently taking her hand.
I know you love her too well to betray this terrible secret.
I would be a nice un, I would,
said Sal with a scorn.
After her lifting me out of the gutter to round on her, a poor girl like me, without a friend or a relative, now Gran's dead.
Calton looked up quickly. It was plain Sal was quite ignorant that Rosanna Moore was her mother. So much the better. They would keep her in ignorance. Perhaps not altogether, but it would be folly to undeceive her at present.
I'm going to Miss Madge now,
she said, going to the door.
And I won't see you again. She's getting light-headed and might let it out, but I'll not let anyone in but myself.
And so saying, she left the room.
Cast thy bread upon the waters,
said Calton oracularly.
The kindness of Miss Frettlby to that poor waif is already bearing fruit. Gratitude is the rarest of qualities, rarer even than modesty.
Fitzgerald made no answer, but stared out of the window, and thought of his darling lying sick unto death, and he able to do nothing to save her.
Well?
Said Calton sharply.
Oh, I beg your pardon,
said Fitzgerald, turning in confusion.
I suppose the will must be read and all that sort of thing.
Yes,
answered the barrister.
I am one of the executors.
And the others?
Yourself and Chinston,
answered Calton.
So I suppose,
turning to the desk,
we can look at his papers and see that all is straight.
Yes, I suppose so,
replied Brian mechanically, his thoughts far away. And then he turned again to the window. Suddenly Calton gave vent to an exclamation of surprise, and turning hastily, Brian saw him holding a thick roll of papers in his hand, which he had taken out of the drawer.
Look here, Fitzgerald,
he said, greatly excited.
Here is Frettlby's confession. Look.
And he held it up. Brian sprang forward in astonishment. So at last the Hansom Cab mystery was to be cleared up. These sheets, no doubt, contained the whole narration of the crime and how it was committed.
We will read it, of course,
he said, hesitating, half hoping that Calton would propose to destroy it at once.
Yes,
answered Calton.
The 3 executors must read it, and then we will burn it.
That will be the better way,
answered Brian gloomily.
Frettlby is dead, and the law can do nothing in the matter, so it's best to avoid the scandal of publicity. But why tell Chinston?
We must,
said Calton decidedly.
He will be sure to gather the truth from Madge's ravings, and he may as well know all. He is quite safe, and will be silent as the grave, but I am more sorry to tell Kilsip.
The detective? Good God, Calton! Surely you will not do so.
I must,
replied the barrister quietly.
Kilsip is firmly persuaded that Morland committed the crime, and I have the same dread of his pertinacity as you had of mine. He may find out all.
What must be,
said Fitzgerald, clenching his hands.
But I hope no one else will find out this miserable story. There's Morland, for instance.
Ah, true,
said Calton thoughtfully.
He called and saw Frettlby the other night, you say?
Yes, I wonder what for.
There is only one answer,
said the barrister slowly.
He must have seen Frettlby following White when he left the hotel and wanted hush money.
I wonder if he got it,
observed Fitzgerald.
Oh, I'll soon find that out,
answered Calton, opening the drawer again and taking out the dead man's cheque-book.
Let me see what cheques have been drawn lately.
Most of the blocks were filled up for small amounts, and one or two for 100 or so. Calton could find no large sum such as Morland would have demanded, when, at the very end of the book, he found a cheque torn off, leaving the block slip quite blank.
There you are,
he said triumphantly, holding out the book to Fitzgerald.
He wasn't such a fool as to write in the amount on the block, but tore the cheque out and wrote in the sum required.
And what's to be done about it?
Let him keep it, of course,
answered Calton, shrugging his shoulders.
It's the only way to secure his silence.
I expect he cashed it yesterday and is off by this time,
said Brian after a moment's pause.
So much the better for us,
said Calton grimly.
But I don't think he's off, or Kilsip would have let me know. We must tell him, or he'll get everything out of Morland, and the consequences will be that all Melbourne will know the story, whereas, by showing him the confession, we get him to leave Morland alone, and thus secure silence in both cases.
I suppose we must see Chinston.
Yes, of course. I will telegraph to him and Kilsip to come up to my office this afternoon at 3 o'clock, and then we will settle the whole matter.
And Sal Rawlins.
Oh, I quite forgot about her,
said Calton in a perplexed voice.
She knows nothing about her parents, and of course Mark Frettlby died in the belief that she was dead.
We must tell Madge,
said Brian gloomily.
There's no help for it. Sal is by rights the heiress to the money of her dead father.
That depends on the will,
replied Calton dryly.
If it specifies that the money is left to my daughter Margaret Frettlby, Sal Rawlins will have no claim, and if such is the case, it will be no good telling her who she is.
What's to be done?
Sal Rawlins,
went on the barrister without noticing the interruption,
has evidently never given a thought to her father or mother, as the old hag no doubt swore they were dead. So I think it will be best to keep silent. That is, if no money is left to her, and, as her father thought her dead, I don't think there will be any. In that case, it would be best to settle an income on her. You can easily find a pretext and let the matter rest.
But suppose in accordance with the wording of the will, she is entitled to all the money.
In that case,
said Calton gravely,
there is only one course open. She must be told everything, and the dividing of the money left to her generosity, but I don't think you need be alarmed. I'm pretty sure Madge is the heiress.
It's not the money I think about,
said Brian hastily.
I take Madge without a penny.
My boy,
said the barrister, placing his hand kindly on Brian's shoulder.
When you marry Madge Frettlby, you will get what is better than money, a heart of gold.
End of chapter 31. Chapter 32 of The Mystery of a Hansom Cab by Fergus Hume. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 32. De Mortuis nil Nisi Bonum.
Nothing is certain but the unforeseen.
So says a French proverb, and judging from the unexpected things which daily happen to us, it is without doubt a very true one. If anyone had told Madge Frettlby one day that she would be stretched on a bed of sickness the next, and would be quite oblivious of the world and its doings, she would have laughed the prophet to scorn. Yet it was so, and she was tossing and turning on a bed of pain, to which the couch of Procrustes was one of roses. Sal sat beside her, ever watchful of her wants, and listened through the bright hours of the day or the still ones of the night to the wild and incoherent words which issued from her lips. She incessantly called on her father to save himself, and then would talk about Brian, and sing snatches of song, or would sob broken sentences about her dead mother, until the heart of the listener ached to hear her. No one was allowed into the room except Sal, and when Dr. Chinston heard the things she was saying, although used to such cases, he recoiled.
"There is blood on your hands,"
cried Madge, sitting up in bed, with her hair all tangled and falling over her shoulders.
"Red blood, and you cannot wash it off. Oh, Cain, God save him. Brian, you are not guilty. My father killed him. God!
And she fell back on her disordered pillows, weeping bitterly. Dr. Chinston did not say anything, but shortly afterwards took his leave, after telling Sal on no account to let anyone see the patient.
"'Tain't likely,"
said Sal in a disgusted tone as she closed the door after him.
"I'm not a viper to sting the bosom as fed me."
From which it may be gathered she was advancing rapidly in her education. Meanwhile Dr. Chinston had received Calton's telegram, and was considerably astonished thereat. He was still more so when, on arriving at the office at the time appointed, he found Calton and Fitzgerald were not alone, but a third man whom he had never seen was with them. The latter Calton introduced to him as Mr. Kilsip of the detective office, a fact which made the worthy doctor uneasy, as he could in no wise divine the meaning of it. However, he made no remark, but took the seat handed to him by Mr. Calton, and prepared to listen. Calton locked the door to the office, and then went back to his desk, having the other three seated before him in a kind of semicircle.
"In the first place,"
said Calton to the doctor,
"I have to inform you that you are one of the executors under the will of the late Mr. Frettlby, and that is why I asked you to come here today. The other executors are Mr. Fitzgerald and myself."
"Oh, indeed,"
murmured the doctor politely.
"And now,"
said Calton, looking at him,
"do you remember the Hansom Cab murder which caused such a sensation some months ago?"
"Yes, I do,"
replied the doctor, rather astonished.
"But what has that to do with the will?"
"Nothing to do with the will,"
answered Calton gravely.
"But the fact is, Mr. Frettlby was implicated in the affair."
Dr. Chinston glanced inquiringly at Brian, but that gentleman shook his head.
"It has nothing to do with my arrest,"
he said sadly. Madge's words, uttered in her delirium, flashed across the doctor's memory.
"What do you mean?"
he gasped, pushing back his chair.
"How was he implicated?"
"That I cannot tell you,"
answered Calton,
"until I read his confession."
"Ah,"
said Kilsip, becoming very attentive.
"Yes,"
said Calton, turning to Kilsip.
"Your hunt after Morland is a wild goose chase, for the murderer of Oliver White is discovered."
"Discovered?"
cried Kilsip and the doctor in one breath.
"Yes, and his name is Mark Frettlby."
Kilsip shot a glance of disdain out of his bright black eyes, and gave a low laugh of disbelief, but the doctor pushed back his chair furiously, and arose to his feet.
"This is monstrous,"
he cried in a rage.
"I won't sit still and hear this accusation against my dead friend."
"Unfortunately, it is too true,"
said Brian sadly.
"How dare you say so?"
said Dr. Chinston, turning angrily on him.
"And you going to marry his daughter?"
"There is only one way to settle the question,"
said Calton coldly.
"We must read his confession."
"But why the detective?"
asked the doctor ungraciously as he took his seat.
"Because I want him to hear for himself that Mr. Frettlby committed the crime, that he may keep silence."
"Not till I've arrested him,"
said Kilsip determinedly.
"But he's dead,"
said Brian.
I'm speaking of Roger Morland,
retorted Kilsip.
For he, and no other, murdered Oliver White.
That's a much more likely story,
Chinston said.
I tell you no,
said Calton vehemently.
God knows I would like to preserve Mark Frettlby's good name, and it is with this object I have called you all together. I will read the confession, and when you know the truth, I want you all to keep silent about it, as Mark Frettlby is dead, and the publication of his crime can do no good to anyone. I know,
resumed Calton, addressing the detective,
that you are fully convinced in your own mind that you are right and I am wrong, but what if I tell you that Mark Frettlby died holding those very papers for the sake of which the crime was committed?
Kilsip's face lengthened considerably.
What were the papers?
The marriage certificate of Mark Frettlby and Rosanna Moore, the woman who died in the back slum.
Kilsip was not often astonished, but he was so now, and Dr. Chinston fell back in his chair, staring at the barrister in blank amazement.
And what's more,
went on Calton triumphantly,
do you know that Morland went to Frettlby 2 nights ago and obtained a certain sum for hush money?
What?
cried Kilsip.
Yes, Morland, in coming out of the hotel, evidently saw Frettlby and threatened to expose him unless he paid for his silence.
Very strange,
murmured Kilsip to himself, with a disappointed look on his face.
But why did Morland keep still so long?
I cannot tell you,
replied Calton.
But no doubt the confession will explain all.
Then for heaven's sake read it,
broke in Dr. Chinston impatiently.
I'm quite in the dark, and all your talk is Greek to me.
One moment,
said Kilsip, dragging a bundle from under his chair and untying it.
If you are right, what about this?
And he held up a light coat, very much soiled and weather-worn.
Whose is that?
asked Calton, startled.
Not White's?
Yes, White's,
repeated Kilsip with great satisfaction.
I found it in the Fitzroy Gardens, near the gate that opens to George Street, East Melbourne. It was up a fir tree.
Then Mr. Frettlby must have got out at Powlett Street and walked down George Street and then through the Fitzroy Gardens into town,
said Calton. Kilsip took no heed of the remark, but took a small bottle out of the pocket of the coat and held it up.
I also found this,
he said.
Chloroform,
cried everyone, guessing at once that it was the missing bottle.
Exactly,
said Kilsip, replacing it.
This was the bottle which contained the poison used by, well, call him the murderer. The name of the chemist being on the label, I went to him and found out who bought it. Now, who do you think?
With a look of triumph.
Frettlby,
said Calton decidedly.
No, Morland,
burst out Chinston, greatly excited.
Neither,
retorted the detective calmly.
The man who purchased this was Oliver White himself.
Himself?
Echoed Brian, now thoroughly surprised, as indeed were all the others.
Yes, I had no trouble in finding that out, thanks to the Poisons Act. As I knew no one would be so foolish as to carry chloroform about in his pocket for any length of time, I mentioned the day of the murder as a probable date it was bought. The chemist turned up in his book and found that White was the purchaser.
And what did he buy it for?
asked Chinston.
That's more than I can tell you,
said Kilsip with a shrug of his shoulders.
It's down in the book as being bought for medicinal purposes, which may mean anything.
The law requires a witness,
observed Calton cautiously.
Who was the witness?
Again Kilsip smiled triumphantly.
I think I can guess,
said Fitzgerald.
Morland.
Kilsip nodded.
And I suppose,
remarked Calton in a slightly sarcastic tone,
that is another of your proofs against Morland. He knew that White had chloroform on him, and therefore he followed him that night and murdered him.
Well,
It's a lot of nonsense,
said the barrister impatiently.
There's nothing against Morland to implicate him. If he killed White, what made him go and see Frettlby?
But,
said Kilsip, sagely nodding his head,
if, as Morland says, he had White's coat in his possession before the murder, how is it that I should discover it afterwards up a fir tree in the Fitzroy Gardens, with an empty chloroform bottle in the pocket?
He may have been an accomplice,
suggested Calton.
What's the good of all this conjecturing?
Said Chinston impatiently, now thoroughly tired of the discussion.
Read the confession, and we will soon know the truth without all this talk.
Calton assented, and all having settled themselves to listen, he began to read what the dead man had written. End of chapter 32. Chapter 33 of The Mystery of a Hansom Cab by Fergus Hume. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 33. The Confession.
What I am now about to write is set forth by me so that the true circumstances connected with the Hansom Cab tragedy, which took place in Melbourne in 18 may be known. I owe a confession particularly to Brian Fitzgerald,
seeing that he was accused of the crime. Although I know he was rightfully acquitted of the charge, yet I wish him to know all about the case, though I am convinced from his altered demeanor towards me that he is better acquainted with it than he chooses to confess. In order to account for the murder of Oliver White, I must go back to the beginning of my life in this colony, and show how the series of events began which culminated in the committal of the crime. Should it be necessary to make this confession public, in the interests of justice, I can say nothing against such a course being taken, but I would be grateful if it could be suppressed, both on account of my good name and of my dear daughter Margaret, whose love and affection has so soothed and brightened my life. If, however, she should be informed of the contents of these pages, I ask her to deal leniently with the memory of one who was sorely tried and tempted. I came to the colony of Victoria, or rather, as it was called then, New South Wales, in the year 18. I had been in a merchant's office in London, but not finding much opportunity for advancement, I looked about to see if I could better myself. I heard of this new land across the ocean, and though it was not then the El Dorado which it afterwards turned out, and, truth to tell, had rather a shady name owing to the transportation of convicts, yet I longed to go there and start a new life. Unhappily, however, I had not the means, and saw nothing better before me than the dreary life of a London clerk, as it was impossible that I could save out of the small salary I got. Just at this time, an old maiden aunt of my mother's died and left a few £100 to me. With this I came out to Australia, determined to become a rich man. I stayed some time in Sydney, and then came over to Port Phillip, now so widely known as marvellous Melbourne, where I intended to pitch my tent. I saw that it was a young and rising colony, though, of course, coming as I did before the days of the gold diggings, I never dreamt it would spring up, as it has done since, into a nation. I was careful and saving in those days, and, indeed, I think it was the happiest time of my life. I bought land whenever I could scrape the money together, and, at the time of the gold rush, was considered well-to-do. When, however, the cry that gold had been discovered was raised, and the eyes of all the nations were turned to Australia with her glittering treasures, men poured in from all parts of the world, and the golden age commenced. I began to grow rich rapidly, and was soon pointed out as the wealthiest man in the colonies. I bought a station, and leaving the riotous, feverish Melbourne life, went to live on it. I enjoyed myself there, for the wild, open-air life had great charms for me, and there was a sense of freedom to which I had hitherto been a stranger. But man is a gregarious animal, and I, growing weary of solitude and communings with modern nature, came down on a visit to Melbourne, where, with companions as gay as myself, I spent my money freely, and, as the phrase goes, saw life. After confessing that I loved the pure life of the country, it sounds strange to say I enjoyed the wild life of the town, but I did. I was neither a Joseph nor a St. Anthony, and I was delighted with Bohemia, with its good fellowship and charming suppers, which took place in the small hours of the morning, when wit and humor reigned supreme. It was at one of these suppers that I first met Rosanna Moore, the woman who was destined to curse my existence. She was a burlesque actress, and all the young fellows in those days were madly in love with her. She was not exactly what was called beautiful, but there was a brilliancy and fascination about her which few could resist. On first seeing her, I did not admire her much, but laughed at my companions as they raved about her. On becoming personally acquainted with her, however, I found that her powers of fascination had not been overrated, and I ended by falling desperately in love with her. I made inquiries about her private life and found that it was irreproachable, as she was guarded by a veritable dragon of a mother, who would let no one approach her daughter. I need not tell about my courtship, as these phases of a man's life are generally the same, but it will be sufficient to prove the depth of my passion for her when I say that I determined to make her my wife. It was on condition, however, that the marriage should be kept secret until such time as I could choose to reveal it. My reason for such a course was this: my father was still alive, and he, being a rigid Presbyterian, would never have forgiven me for having married a woman of the stage. So, as he was old and feeble, I did not wish him to learn that I had done so, fearing that the shock would be too much for him in his then state of health. I told Rosanna I would marry her, but wanted her to leave her mother, who was a perfect fury, and not an agreeable person to live with. As I was rich, young, and not bad-looking, Rosanna consented, and during an engagement she had in Sydney, I went over there and married her. She never told her mother she had married me. Why, I do not know, as I laid no restriction on her doing so. The mother made a great noise over the matter, but I gave Rosanna a large sum of money for her, and this the old harridan accepted, and left for New Zealand. Rosanna went with me to my station, where we lived as man and wife, though in Melbourne she was supposed to be my mistress. At last, feeling degraded in my own eyes at the way in which I was supposed to be living, I wanted to reveal our secret, but this Rosanna would not consent to. I was astonished at this, and could never discover the reason, but in many ways Rosanna was an enigma to me. She then grew weary of the quiet country life and longed to return to the glitter and glare of the footlights. This I refused to let her do, and from that moment she took a dislike to me. A child was born, and for a time she was engrossed with it, but soon wearied of the new plaything, and again pressed me to allow her to return to the stage. I again refused, and we became estranged from one another. I grew gloomy and irritable, and was accustomed to take long rides by myself, frequently being away for days. There was a great friend of mine who owned the next station, a fine, handsome young fellow called Frank Kelly, with a gay, sunny disposition, and a wonderful flow of humor. When he found I was so much away, thinking Rosanna was only my mistress, he began to console her, and succeeded so well that one day, on my return from a ride, I found she had fled with him, and had taken the child with her. She left a letter saying that she had never really cared for me, but had married me for my money. She would keep our marriage secret, and was going to return to the stage. I followed my false friend and false wife down to Melbourne, but arrived too late, as they had just left for England. Disgusted with the manner in which I had been treated, I plunged into a whirl of dissipation, trying to drown the memory of my married life. My friends, of course, thought that my loss amounted to no more than that of a mistress, and I soon began myself to doubt that I had ever been married. So far away and visionary did my life of the previous year seem. I continued my fast life for about 6 months, when suddenly I was arrested upon the brink of destruction by an angel. I say this advisedly, for if ever there was an angel upon earth, it was she who afterwards became my wife. She was the daughter of a doctor, and it was her influence which drew me back from the dreary path of profligacy and dissipation which I was then leading. I paid her great attention, and we were, in fact, looked upon as good as engaged, but I knew that I was still linked to that accursed woman, and could not ask her to be my wife. At this second crisis of my life, fate again intervened, for I received a letter from England which informed me that Rosanna Moore had been run over in the streets of London, and had died in an hospital. The writer was a young doctor who had attended her, and I wrote home to him, begging him to send out a certificate of her death so that I might be sure she was no more. He did so, and also enclosed an account of the accident which had appeared in a newspaper. Then, indeed, I felt that I was free and closing, as I thought, forever the darkest page of my life's history. I began to look forward to the future. I married again, and my domestic life was a singularly happy one. As the colony grew greater, with every year I became even more wealthy than I had been, and was looked up to and respected by my fellow citizens. When my dear daughter Margaret was born, I felt that my cup of happiness was full, but suddenly I received a disagreeable reminder of the past. Rosanna's mother made her appearance one day, a disreputable-looking creature smelling of gin, in whom I could not recognize the respectably dressed woman who used to accompany Rosanna to the theater. She had spent long ago all the money I had given her, and had sank lower and lower, until she now lived in a slum off Little Bourke Street. I made inquiries after the child, and she told me it was dead. Rosanna had not taken it to England with her, but had left it in her mother's charge, and no doubt neglect and want of proper nourishment was the cause of its death. There now seemed to be no link to bind me to the past, with the exception of the old hag, who knew nothing about the marriage. I did not attempt to undeceive her, but agreed to allow her enough to live on if she promised never to trouble me again, and to keep quiet about everything which had reference to my connection with her daughter. She promised readily enough, and went back to her squalid dwelling in the slums, where, for all I know, she still lives, as money has been paid to her regularly every month by my solicitors. I heard nothing more about the matter, and now felt quite satisfied that I had heard the last of Rosanna. As years rolled on, things prospered with me, and so fortunate was I in all speculations that my luck became proverbial. Then, alas, when all things seemed to smile upon me, my wife died, and the world has never seemed the same to me since. But I had my dear daughter to console me, and in her love and affection I became reconciled to the loss of my wife. A young Irish gentleman called Brian Fitzgerald came out to Australia, and I soon saw that my daughter was in love with him, and that he reciprocated that affection, whereat I was glad, as I have always esteemed him highly. I looked forward to their marriage, when suddenly a series of events occurred, which must be fresh in the memory of those who read these pages. Mr. Oliver White, a gentleman from London, called on me and startled me with the news that my first wife, Rosanna Moore, was still living, and that the story of her death had been an ingenious fabrication in order to deceive me. she had met with an accident, as stated in the newspaper, and had been taken to an hospital, where she recovered. The young doctor who had sent me the certificate of her death had fallen in love with her and wanted to marry her, and had told me that she was dead in order that her past life might be obliterated. The doctor, however, died before the marriage, and Rosanna did not trouble herself about undeceiving me. She was then acting on the burlesque stage under the name of Musette, and seemed to have gained an unenviable notoriety by her extravagance and infamy. White met her in London, and she became his mistress. He seemed to have had a wonderful influence over her, for she told him all her past life and about her marriage with me. Her popularity being on the wane in London, as she was now growing old and had to make way for younger actresses, White proposed that they should proceed to the colonies and extort money from me, and he had come to me for that purpose. The villain told me all this in the coolest manner, and I, knowing he held the secret of my life, was unable to resent it. I refused to see Rosanna, but told White I would agree to his terms, which were, first, a large sum of money was to be paid to Rosanna, and, secondly, that he should marry my daughter. I at first absolutely declined to sanction the latter proposal, but as he threatened to publish the story, and that meant the proclamation to the world of my daughter's illegitimacy, I at last agreed, and he began to pay his addresses to Madge. She, however, refused to marry him, and told me she was engaged to Fitzgerald. So, after a severe struggle with myself, I told White that I would not allow him to marry Madge, but would give him whatever sum he liked to name. On the night he was murdered, he came to see me and showed me the certificate of marriage between myself and Rosanna Moore. He refused to take a sum of money and said that unless I consented to his marriage with Madge, he would publish the whole affair. I implored him to give me time to think, so he said he would give me 2 days, but no more, and left the house, taking the marriage certificate with him. I was in despair, and saw that the only way to save myself was to obtain possession of the marriage certificate and deny everything. With this idea in my mind, I followed him up to town and saw him meet Morland and drink with him. They went into the hotel in Russell Street, and when White came out at 12:30, he was quite intoxicated. I saw him go along to the Scotch church near the Bourke and Wills monument, and cling to the lamp-post at the corner. I thought I would then be able to get the certificate from him, as he was so drunk, when I saw a gentleman in a light coat, I did not know it was Fitzgerald, come up to him and hail a cab for him. I saw there was nothing more to be done at that time, so in despair went home and waited for the next day, in fear lest he should carry out his determination. Nothing, however, turned up, and I was beginning to think that White had abandoned his purpose, when I heard that he had been murdered in the Hansom Cab. I was in great fear lest the marriage certificate should be found on him, but nothing was said about it. This I could not understand at all. I knew he had it on him, and I could only conclude that the murderer, whoever he was, had taken it from the body, and would sooner or later come to me to extort money, knowing that I dare not denounce him. Fitzgerald was arrested, and afterwards acquitted, so I began to think that the certificate had been lost, and my troubles were at an end. However, I was also haunted by a dread that the sword was hanging over my head, and would fall sooner or later. I was right, for 2 nights ago Roger Morland, who was an intimate friend of White's, called on me and produced the marriage certificate, which he offered to sell to me for £5,000. In horror, I accused him of murdering White, which he denied at first, but afterwards acknowledged, stating that I dare not betray him for my own sake. I was nearly mad with the horror I was placed in. either to denounce my daughter as illegitimate or let a murderer escape the penalty of his crime. At last I agreed to keep silent, and handed him a check for £5,000, receiving in return the marriage certificate. I then made Moreland swear to leave the colony, which he readily agreed to do, saying Melbourne was dangerous. When he left, I reflected upon the awfulness of my position, and I had almost determined to commit suicide. But, thank God, I was saved from that crime. I write this confession in order that after my death, the true story of the murder of White may be known, and that anyone who may hereafter be accused of the murder may not be wrongfully punished. I have no hopes of Moreland ever receiving the penalty of his crime, as when this is opened all trace of him will no doubt be lost. I will not destroy the marriage certificate, but place it with these papers so that the truth of my story can be seen. In conclusion,
I would ask forgiveness of my daughter Margaret for my sins, which have been visited on her, but she can see for herself that circumstances were too strong for me. May she forgive me, as I hope God in his infinite mercy will, and may she come sometimes and pray over my grave, nor think too hardly upon her dead father.
End of chapter 33. Chapter 34 of The Mystery of a Hansom Cab by Fergus Hume. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 34. The Hands of Justice. Calton's voice faltered a little when he read those last sad words, and he laid the manuscript down on the table amid a dead silence, which was first broken by Brian.
Thank God,
he said reverently.
Thank God he was innocent of the crime.
No,
said Calton a little cynically.
The riddle which has perplexed us so long is read, and the Sphinx is silent for evermore.
I knew he was incapable of such a thing,
cried Chinston, whom emotion had hitherto kept silent. Meanwhile, Kilsip listened to these eulogistic remarks on the dead man and purred to himself in a satisfied kind of way, like a cat who has caught a mouse.
You see, sir,
he said, addressing the barrister,
I was right after all.
Yes,
answered Calton frankly.
I acknowledge my defeat, but now?
I'm going to arrest Moreland right off,
said Kilsip. There was a silence for a few moments, and then Calton spoke again.
I suppose it must be so. Poor girl, poor girl.
I'm very sorry for the young lady myself,
said the detective in his soft, low voice.
But you see, I cannot let a dangerous criminal escape for a mere matter of sentiment.
Of course not,
said Fitzgerald sharply.
Moreland must be arrested right off.
But he will confess everything,
cried Calton angrily.
And then everyone will know about this first marriage.
Let them,
retorted Brian bitterly.
As soon as she is well enough, we will marry at once and leave Australia forever.
But
I know her better than you do,
said the young man doggedly.
And I know she would like an end made of this whole miserable business at once. Arrest the murderer and let him suffer for his crime.
Well, I suppose it must be so,
said Chinston with a sigh.
But it seems very hard that the slur should be cast upon Miss Frettlby.
Brian turned a little pale.
The sins of the father are generally visited upon the children by the world,
he said bitterly.
But after the first pain is over, in new lands among new faces, she will forget the bitter past.
Now that it is settled, Moreland is to be arrested,
said Calton.
How is it to be done? Is he still in Melbourne?
Rather,
said Kilsip in a satisfied tone.
I've had my eye on him for the last 2 months, and someone is watching him for me now. Trust me, he can't move 2 steps without my knowing it.
Ah, indeed,
said Calton quickly.
Then do you know if he has been to the bank and cashed that cheque for 5,000 which Frettlby gave him?
Well now,
observed Kilsip after a pause.
Do you know, you rather startled me when you told me that he had received a cheque for that amount.
Why?
It's such a large one,
replied the detective.
And had I known what sum he had paid into his account, I should have been suspicious.
Then he has been to the bank?
To his own bank, yes. He went there yesterday afternoon at 2:00. That is to say, the day after he got it. So it would be sent round to Mr. Frettlby's bank, and would not be returned till next day. And as he died in the meantime, I expect it hasn't been honoured. So Mr. Morland won't have his money yet.
I wonder what he'll do,
said Chinston.
Go to the manager and kick up a row,
replied Kilsip coolly.
And the manager will, no doubt, tell him he'd better see the executors.
But, my good friend, the manager doesn't know who the executors are,
broke in Calton impatiently.
You forget the will has yet to be read.
Then he'll tell him to go to the late Mr. Frettlby's solicitors. I suppose he knows who they are,
retorted Kilsip.
Thinton and Tarbet,
said Calton musingly.
But it's questionable if Morland would go to them.
But why shouldn't he, sir?
Said Kilsip quickly.
He does not know anything about this,
laying his hand on the confession.
And as the cheque is genuine enough, he won't let £5,000 go without a struggle.
I'll tell you what,
observed Calton after a few moments of reflection.
I'll go across the way and telephone to Thinton and Tarbet, and when he calls on them, they can send him up to me.
A very good idea,
said Kilsip, rubbing his hands.
And then I can arrest him.
But the warrant,
interposed Brian as Calton rose and put on his hat.
Is here,
said the detective, producing it.
By Jove, you must have been pretty certain of his guilt,
remarked Chinston dryly.
Of course I was,
retorted Kilsip in a satisfied tone of voice.
When I told the magistrate where I found the coat, and reminded him of Morland's acknowledgment at the trial, that he had it in his possession before the murder, I soon got him to see the necessity of having Morland arrested.
4:30,
said Calton, pausing for a moment at the door and looking at his watch.
I'm afraid it's rather late to catch Morland today. However, I'll see what Thinton and Tarbet know.
And he went out. The rest sat waiting his return and chatted about the curious end of the Hansom Cab mystery, when, in about 10 minutes, Calton rushed in hurriedly and closed the door after him quickly.
Fate is playing into our hands,
he said as soon as he recovered his breath.
Morland called on Thinton and Tarbet, as Kilsip surmised, and as neither of them was in, he said he would call again before 5 o'clock. I told the clerk to bring him up to me at once, so he may be here at any moment.
That is, if he's fool enough to come,
observed Chinston.
Oh, he'll come,
said the detective confidently, rattling a pair of handcuffs together.
He is so satisfied that he has made things safe that he'll walk right into the trap.
It was getting a little dusk, and the four men were greatly excited, though they concealed it under an assumed nonchalance.
What a situation for a drama,
said Brian.
Only,
said Chinston quietly.
It is as realistic as in the old days of the Colosseum, where the actor who played Orpheus was torn to pieces by bears at the end of the play.
His last appearance on any stage, I suppose,
said Calton, a little cruelly, it must be confessed. Meanwhile, Kilsip remained seated in his chair, humming an operatic air and chinking the handcuffs together by way of accompaniment. He felt intensely pleased with himself, the more so as he saw that by this capture he would be ranked far above Gorby.
And what would Gorby say? Gorby, who had laughed at all his ideas as foolish, and who had been quite wrong from the first. If only—
Hush,
said Calton, holding up his finger, as steps were heard echoing on the flags outside.
He is here, I believe.
Kilsip arose from his chair and, stealing softly to the window, looked cautiously out. Then he turned round to those inside and, nodding his head, slipped the handcuffs into his pocket. Just as he did so, there was a knock at the door, and in response to Calton's invitation to enter, Thinton and Talbot's clerk came in with Roger Morland. The latter faltered a little on the threshold when he saw Calton was not alone, and seemed half inclined to retreat. But evidently thinking there was no danger of his secret being discovered, he pulled himself together and advanced into the room in an easy and confident manner.
"This is the gentleman who wants to know about the cheque, sir?"
said Thinton and Talbot's clerk to Calton.
"Oh, indeed,"
answered Calton quietly.
"I'm glad to see him. You can go."
The clerk bowed and went out, closing the door after him. Morland took his seat directly in front of Calton and with his back to the door. Kilsip, seeing this, strolled across the room in a nonchalant manner while Calton engaged Morland in conversation, and quietly turned the key.
"You want to see me, sir?"
said Calton, resuming his seat.
"Yes, that is, alone,"
replied Morland uneasily.
"Oh, these gentlemen are my friends,"
said Calton quietly.
"Anything you may say is quite safe."
"That they are your friends and are quite safe is nothing to me,"
said Morland insolently.
"I wish to speak to you in private."
"Don't you think you would like to know my friends?"
said Calton, coolly taking no notice of his remark.
"Your friends, sir!"
cried Morland furiously, rising from his seat. Calton laughed and introduced Mr. Morland to the others.
"Dr. Chinston, Mr. Kilsip, and Mr. Fitzgerald."
"Fitzgerald?"
gasped Morland, growing pale.
What's that?"
He shrieked as he saw White's coat, all weather-stained, lying on a chair near him, and which he immediately recognised.
"That is a rope that's going to hang you,"
said Kilsip quietly, coming behind him.
"For the murder of Oliver White."
"Trapped by God!"
shouted the wretched man, wheeling round so as to face Kilsip. He sprang at the detective's throat, and they both rolled together on the floor, but the latter was too strong for him, and after a sharp struggle he succeeded in getting the handcuffs on Morland's wrists. The others stood perfectly quiet, knowing that Kilsip required no assistance. Now that there was no possibility of escape, Morland seemed to become resigned, and rose sullenly off the floor.
"I'll make you pay for this,"
he hissed between his teeth, with a white, despairing face.
"You can't prove anything."
"Can't we?"
said Calton, touching the confession.
"You are wrong. This is the confession of Mark Frettlby, made before he died."
"It's a lie."
"A jury will decide that,"
said the barrister dryly.
"Meanwhile, you will pass the night in the Melbourne jail."
"Perhaps they'll give me the same cell as you occupied,"
said Morland with a hard laugh, turning to Fitzgerald.
"I should like it for its old associations."
Brian did not answer him, but picking up his hat and gloves, prepared to go.
"Stop!"
cried Morland fiercely.
"I see that it's all up with me, so I'm not going to lie like a coward. I've played for a big stake and lost, but if I hadn't been such a fool, I'd have cashed that cheque the next morning and been far away by this time."
"It certainly would have been wiser,"
said Calton.
"After all,"
said Morland nonchalantly, taking no notice of his remark,
"I don't know that I'm sorry about it. I've had hell on earth since I killed White."
"Then you acknowledge your guilt?"
said Brian quietly. Morland shrugged his shoulders.
"I told you I wasn't a coward,"
he answered coolly.
"Yes, I did it. It was White's own fault. When I met him that night, he told me how Frettlby wouldn't let him marry his daughter, but said he'd make him, and showed me the marriage certificate. I thought if I could only get it, I'd make a nice little pile out of Frettlby over it. So when White went on drinking, I did not. After he had gone out of the hotel, I put on his coat, which he left behind. I saw him standing near the lamp-post, and Fitzgerald come up and then leave him. When you came down the street,"
he went on, turning to Fitzgerald,
"I shrank back into the shadow, and when you passed, I ran up to White as the cabman was putting him into the hansom. He took me for you, so I didn't undeceive him, but I swear I had no idea of murdering White when I got into the cab. I tried to get the papers, but he wouldn't let me, and commenced to sing out. Then I thought of the chloroform in the pocket of his coat, which I was wearing. I pulled it out, and found that the cork was loose. Then I took out White's handkerchief, which was also in the coat, and emptied the bottle on it, and put it back in my pocket. I again tried to get the papers without using the chloroform, but couldn't, so I clapped the handkerchief over his mouth, and he went off after a few minutes, and I got the papers. I thought he was only insensible, and it was only when I saw the newspapers that I knew he was dead. I stopped the cab in St. Kilda Road, got out and caught another cab which was going to town. Then I got out at Powlett Street, took off the coat, and carried it over my arm. I went down George Street, towards the Fitzroy Gardens, and having hid the coat up a tree, where I suppose you found it,
to Kilsip,
I walked home. So I've done you all nicely, but...
You're caught at last,
finished Kilsip quietly. Morland fell down in a chair with an air of utter weariness and lassitude.
No man can be stronger than destiny,
he said dreamily.
I have lost, and you have won. So life is a chessboard after all, and we are the puppets of fate.
He refused to utter another word, so, leaving Calton and Kilsip with him, Brian and the doctor went out and hailed a cab. It drove up to the entrance of the court where Calton's office was, and then Morland, walking as if in a dream, left the room and got into the cab, followed by Kilsip.
Do you know,
said Chinston thoughtfully as they stood and watched the cab drive off,
do you know what the end of that man will be?
It requires no prophet to foretell that,
said Calton dryly.
He will be hanged.
No, he won't,
retorted the doctor.
He will commit suicide.
End of chapter 34. Chapter 35 of The Mystery of a Hansom Cab by Fergus Hume. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 35. The Love That Lives. There are certain periods in the life of man when fate seems to have done her worst, and any further misfortunes which may befall are accepted with a philosophical resignation begotten by the very severity of previous trials. Fitzgerald was in this state of mind. He was calm, but it was the calmness of despair. The misfortunes of the past year seemed to have come to a climax, and he looked forward to the publication of the whole bitter story with an indifference that surprised himself. His own name and that of Madge and her dead father would be on every tongue, yet he felt perfectly callous to whatever might be said on the subject. So long as Madge recovered and they could go away to another part of the world, leaving Australia with its bitter memories behind, he did not care. Morland would suffer the bitter penalty of his crime, and then nothing more would ever be heard of the matter. It would be better for the whole story to be told and transitory pain endured than to go on striving to hide the infamy and shame which might be discovered at any moment. Already the news was all over Melbourne that the murderer of Oliver White had been captured, and that his confession would bring to light certain startling facts concerning the late Mark Frettlby. Brian well knew that the world winked at secret vices so long as there was an attempt at concealment, though it was cruelly severe on those which were brought to light, and that many whose lives might be secretly far more culpable than poor Mark Frettlby's would be the first to slander the dead man. The public curiosity, however, was destined never to be gratified, for the next day it was known that Roger Morland had hanged himself in his cell during the night, and had left no confession behind him. When Brian heard this, he breathed a heartfelt prayer of thanks for his deliverance, and went to see Calton, whom he found at his chambers, in deep conversation with Chinston and Kilsip. They all came to the conclusion that as Morland was now dead, nothing could be gained by publishing the confession of Mark Frettlby, so agreed to burn it, and when Fitzgerald saw in the heap of blackened papers in the fireplace all that remained of the bitter story, he felt a weight lifted off his heart. The barrister, Chinston, and Kilsip all promised to keep silence, and they kept the promise nobly, for nothing was ever known of the circumstances which led to the death of Oliver White, and it was generally supposed that it must have been caused by some quarrel between the dead man and his friend Roger Morland. Fitzgerald, however, did not forget the good service that Kilsip had done him, and gave him a sum of money which made him independent for life, though he still followed his old profession of a detective from sheer love of excitement, and was always looked upon with admiration as the man who had solved the mystery of the famous Hansom Cab murder. Brian, after several consultations with Calton, at last came to the conclusion that it would be useless to reveal to Sal Rawlins the fact that she was Mark Frettlby's daughter, as, by the will, the money was clearly left to Madge, and such a revelation could bring her no pecuniary benefit, while her bringing up unfitted her for the position. So a yearly income, more than sufficient for her wants, was settled upon her, and she was allowed to remain in ignorance of her parentage. The influence of Sal Rawlins' old life, however, was very strong on her, and she devoted herself to the task of saving her fallen sisters. Knowing, as she did, all the intricacies of the slums, she was enabled to do an immense amount of good, and many an unhappy woman was saved from the squalor and hardship of a gutter life by the kind hand of Sal Rawlins. Felix Rolleston became a member of Parliament, where his speeches, if not very deep, were at least amusing, and while in the House he always behaved like a gentleman, which could not be said of all his parliamentary colleagues. Madge slowly recovered from her illness, and as she had been explicitly named in the will as heiress to Mark Frettlby's great wealth, she placed the management of her estates in the hands of Mr. Calton, who, with Thinton and Tarbert, acted as her agents in Australia. On her recovery, she learned the story of her father's early marriage, but both Calton and Fitzgerald were silent about the fact of Sal Rawlins being her half-sister, as such a relation could do no good, and would only create a scandal, as no explanation could be given except the true one. Shortly afterwards, Madge married Fitzgerald, and both of them only too gladly left Australia with all its sorrows and bitter memories. Standing with her husband on the deck of one of the P&O steamers as it ploughed the blue waters of Hobson's Bay into foam, they both watched Melbourne gradually fade from their view under the glow of the sunset. They could see the two great domes of the Exhibition and the Law Courts, and also Government House with its tall tower rising from the midst of the green trees. In the background was a bright crimson sky barred with masses of black clouds, and over all the great city hung a cloud of smoke like a pall. The flaring red light of the sinking sun glared angrily on the heavy waters, and the steamer seemed to be making its way through a sea of blood. Madge, clinging to her husband's arm, felt her eyes fill with tears as she saw the land of her birth receding slowly.
"Goodbye,"
she murmured softly.
"Goodbye forever."
"You do not regret?"
he said, bending his head.
"Regret? No,"
she answered, looking at him with loving eyes.
"With you by my side I fear nothing. Surely our hearts have been tried in the furnace of affliction, and our love has been chastened and purified."
"We are sure of nothing in this world,"
replied Brian with a sigh.
"But after all the sorrow and grief of the past, let us hope that the future will be peace."
"Peace."
A white-winged seagull rose suddenly from the crimson waters and circled rapidly in the air above them.
"A happy omen,"
she said, looking up fondly to the grey face of her husband.
"For your life and for mine."
He bent down and kissed her. The great steamer moved slowly out to sea, and as they stood on the deck, hand clasped in hand, with the fresh salt breeze blowing keenly in their faces, it bore them away into the placid beauty of the coming night, towards the old world and the new life. End of chapter 35. End of The Mystery of a Hansom Cab by Fergus Hume.